He shoved her first. That was the part nobody talked about afterward. Not the gunfire, not the bodies on the floor, not the 6 trained killers who walked into that diner thinking the night would go a certain way. What nobody mentioned was that, before any of that happened, before the world turned upside down inside that cramped little diner on West Madison Street, one of those men reached across the counter and shoved a 26-year-old waitress hard enough to knock the coffee pot out of her hand. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at him, really looked at him, with those quiet dark eyes, and she picked the coffee pot up off the floor, and she set it back on the burner. And in that single moment, if you had been standing in that diner at 2 in the morning, soaking wet from the November rain, watching that slim young woman in her faded blue uniform make that one calm, deliberate choice, you would have felt it too. Something is about to happen that none of us are ready for. If a story like this speaks to you, the kind where ordinary people do extraordinary things when everything is on the line, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, leave a like. It means more than you know. Now settle in. This is going to take a while, and every minute of it is worth it. The diner had a name, Patty's All Night, but nobody in that neighborhood called it that anymore. Most of the regulars just called it the place on Madison, or, if they were being generous, the diner with the good pie. The sign above the door had been missing the letter P in Patty's for going on 3 years, so from the street it just read Atty's All Night, which a few of the night shift cabbies thought was funnier than it probably was. It was the kind of place that smelled like burnt coffee and dish soap and something faintly sweet underneath both of those things. Maybe the blueberry pie. Maybe just years of people eating meals they couldn't afford in a room that didn't judge them for it. The booths were vinyl, cracked at the seams and repaired with electrical tape in 2 places. The counter had 11 stools, 4 of which wobbled. The fluorescent light above the register had been flickering since September, and nobody had gotten around to fixing it. Nora Vale had been working the graveyard shift there for 2 years and 4 months. She knew which stool wobbled worst. She knew which booth was coldest because of the gap in the window frame. She knew that the couple in booth 3, the man with the hearing aid and his wife, who always ordered the same thing, decaf and a slice of lemon cake, came in every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, and that the wife always cut her husband's slice because his hands shook now, and that neither of them ever mentioned it. She knew the names of the overnight security guard from the parking garage next door, who came in at 1:15 every single morning and sat at the far end of the counter and never ordered anything but black coffee and a side of wheat toast. His name was Gerald. He was 63. He had a grandson named Marcus who played Little League, and Nora had heard about every single one of Marcus's games for the past 2 years, whether she'd asked or not. She liked Gerald. She liked the couple in booth 3. She liked her small, predictable world at 2 in the morning, when the city had mostly gone quiet, and the people who came through the door were the ones who needed somewhere to be rather than somewhere to be seen. She was not a person who wanted to be seen. That was the thing about Nora Vale that you would have noticed if you'd paid attention, which most people didn't. She was the kind of woman who occupied exactly as much space as she needed, and not 1 inch more. She moved through a room like she already knew where everything was, and had already considered every possible obstacle and adjusted accordingly. Not rushed, not nervous, just efficient, in a way that was almost invisible because it looked so effortless. She was 26 years old. She stood 5'5" and weighed maybe 130 pounds on a day she'd eaten well. She had dark hair she kept pulled back while she worked, and a face that people described, when they described it at all, as nice. Not beautiful, not plain, just nice. The kind of face that made people feel comfortable without quite knowing why. She had no social media presence of any kind. She rented a studio apartment 8 blocks away and paid her rent in money orders. She had a library card and she used it. She had 2 friends, a woman named Delia, who worked at the laundromat on Carpenter Street, and an elderly man named Mr. Kowalski, who lived in her building and whose cat she fed when he visited his daughter in Milwaukee. She had never, in 2 years and 4 months, mentioned anything about her life before Chicago. Not once. Not to Gerald. Not to her manager, a heavy-set man named Ray, who worked days and had given up asking personal questions after the 3rd time she deflected one so smoothly he hadn't even realized it had happened until an hour later. Not to anyone. She poured coffee. She took orders. She cleared tables. She learned everyone's names and remembered their preferences and was unfailingly kind without being warm in a way that invited questions. It was, if you knew what you were looking at, a performance of perfect ordinariness. And on the night of November 14th, at exactly 7 minutes past 2 in the morning, the performance ended. The rain had started around midnight, the kind of cold November rain that didn't fall so much as arrive, driving sideways off the lake and making the streets look like the set of a movie nobody wanted to be in. By 1 a.m., the temperature had dropped enough that the rain was thinking about becoming sleet, and the people who had been out earlier had mostly found somewhere to be. The diner had 4 customers when it happened. Gerald was at the end of the counter with his toast and his coffee, reading something on his phone with his glasses pushed up on his forehead in the way that meant he couldn't actually read it but hadn't accepted that yet. The couple from booth 3, the man with the hearing aid whose name was Frank, and his wife Eleanor, were in their usual spot. Eleanor was telling Frank something that was making him laugh quietly, the kind of laugh old people have when they've been married long enough that the same things are still funny. And in the booth nearest the door, a young woman in nursing scrubs had been staring at a plate of untouched eggs for 20 minutes, the kind of staring that meant she wasn't seeing the eggs at all. Nora had noticed the nurse. She'd thought about saying something. She'd decided not to yet. Some things you needed to sit with before someone else touched them. She was behind the counter refilling the decaf carafe when she heard the sound outside. Tires, multiple sets, moving fast and then stopping hard. The screech of it reached through the rain and the door and the hiss of the coffee machine, and she registered it before she was aware she'd heard it. She looked up. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see vehicles. Black SUVs, 3 of them, pulled up across the front of the diner in a way that blocked the street in both directions. Not parked. Positioned. The doors opened. Men got out, several of them, moving quickly, purposefully, heads down against the rain. She had approximately 4 seconds before the door opened, and she used all 4 of them. She registered the layout of the room, the position of every customer, the distance between the counter and the nearest booth, the weight of the coffee carafe in her hand, the location of the emergency exit at the back of the kitchen, the gap between stool number 7 and the edge of the counter, the fact that Gerald was in the worst possible position, alone, exposed, at the far end of the counter with nowhere to go. She had already moved the coffee carafe to her left hand before the door opened. The man who came in first was not remarkable to look at. That was, she understood immediately, intentional. He was dressed like a man who had been out for a late dinner. Dark jacket, dark pants, the kind of clothes that said nothing so effectively, they said everything. He was broad through the shoulders, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had since become something harder. He moved into the room the way men move into rooms when they have already decided what happens in them. Behind him came 3 more. They spread out without being told to, taking up positions near the door, near the window, near the hall that led to the restrooms. Nobody reached for anything visible. Nobody made a sound. The nurse in the scrubs looked up from her eggs and went very, very still. Eleanor reached under the table and took Frank's hand. Gerald put his phone down. The man in the dark jacket walked to the center of the room, looked slowly around it, and then he looked at Nora. "Coffee," he said. His voice was flat. Not rude, not aggressive, just completely, absolutely indifferent to her existence in a way that was somehow worse than either of those things. The voice of a man who had never in his adult life considered that a person serving him coffee was a person. Nora looked at him for 1 beat. "Sure," she said. "Just a moment." She turned to reach for a clean mug, and in that moment she heard the door open again. She knew, without turning, that this was different. The air in the room changed. She had learned a long time ago to trust that the way pressure changes before a storm, something that the body detects before the mind catches up. She set the mug down carefully, not rushing, and she turned around. The man who had just walked through the door was not large. He was average in height, perhaps late 50s, with silver at his temples, and the kind of controlled, deliberate stillness that cost more than any suit. He wore a dark overcoat that was still wet from the rain, and behind him came 2 more men who moved differently from the ones already inside. Sharper, more coiled, the kind of men who had spent years learning how to stand in a room full of threats. His name was Salvatore De Luca, though Nora did not know that yet. What she knew was what she saw, a man who was bleeding. Not badly. It was a long cut along the left side of his jaw, The kind of wound you get when something passes very close to your face and you are fast enough or lucky enough to turn at the right moment. Someone had bandaged it roughly, the kind of field dressing that said we didn't have time to do this properly. His shirt beneath the overcoat was dark, and she couldn't tell in the diner's lighting whether that was its color or whether it wasn't. He looked around the room with eyes that had seen everything and were surprised by nothing, and then he walked to the counter and sat down. Not at the end, and not in a corner. He sat 2 stools from center in plain sight, which told her something about the kind of man he was, not the kind who hid. He looked at her. "Coffee," he said. "Black." His voice was nothing like the first man's. It was quiet and controlled and carried the particular exhaustion of a person who had been running on adrenaline for hours and was beginning to feel the edges of what that cost. Nora reached for the mug she'd already set out and poured. She slid it across the counter to him. He wrapped both hands around it and just held it for a moment, not drinking, just holding the warmth. Something in her chest shifted slightly at that, which was a feeling she didn't welcome and set aside. The 2 groups of men, the ones who had come in first and the ones who had come in with DeLuca, had become aware of each other in the way that 2 packs of animals become aware of each other. That slow, rigid, sideways attention that precedes either accommodation or violence. DeLuca's men had positioned themselves instinctively, putting their principle between themselves and the door. The first group had gone very still. Nobody had drawn anything. Nobody had moved. But the room felt like a piano wire pulled 1/2 turn past where it was designed to go. Gerald was looking at Nora. Not panicking. Gerald was not a man who panicked. 20 years of overnight security work had cured him of that. But asking her with his eyes what she wanted him to do. She gave him the smallest possible shake of her head. "Nothing. Don't do anything." She topped off his coffee without being asked, purely to have something to do with her hands. DeLuca had started drinking his coffee. She watched him out of her peripheral vision. He drank it carefully, deliberately, like it was medication. He was aware of everything in the room. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, the minimal but absolute way he tracked every position without appearing to look at anything directly. But he was also, genuinely, exhausted. There was a slight tremor in his left hand that he was controlling through the grip on the mug. That was the moment she realized the cut on his jaw was not the worst of his injuries. She was about to say something. She hadn't decided what, just something neutral, because the tension in the room was building towards something, and she needed to redirect it the way you redirected a pot that was beginning to boil over. When the door opened a 3rd time, and everything changed. There were 6 of them. They came through the door fast and organized, and the first thing Nora registered was that they were not the same as either of the groups already in the room. These men were dressed for work. Not dinner, not business. Work. Dark tactical clothing, no logos. The kind of coordinated that comes from training together. The first one through the door had a shotgun that he'd held beneath his coat and produced in a single motion so practiced it looked easy. The second had 2 handguns, one already raised. The others were still coming through the door. "Down!" The man with the shotgun swept the barrel across the room. "Everyone on the floor! Now!" Eleanor made a sound that was not quite a scream. Frank pulled her down with him, both of them moving for the floor beneath the booth. Gerald was already off his stool, moving toward the ground with the calm of someone who had practiced fire drills enough times that the instinct was automatic. The nurse in the scrubs had knocked her plate off the table when she flinched, and eggs and toast were spread across the floor around her booth, and she was pressing herself against the wall with both hands over her mouth. The men, DeLuca's men, had drawn weapons, and the room erupted into that frozen, suspended, multi-directional standoff that precedes either catastrophe or negotiation, and is rarely either one cleanly. DeLuca had not moved from his stool. He had not drawn anything. He was looking at the 6 men with an expression that was very calm and very tired, and he was still holding his coffee mug. The man with the shotgun, the leader, clearly, or at least the one talking, stepped forward. He was looking at DeLuca. He was not looking at Nora. "You know what this is," he said. "I have a guess," DeLuca said. "Then you know how it ends." DeLuca's left hand moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket. It was too slow. She could see immediately it was too slow. His arm wasn't responding the way he needed it to, and the man with the shotgun saw it too, and he smiled, and he stepped forward, and he reached across the counter, and he shoved Nora out of the way. Just that. A single, contemptuous shove, one arm extended, because she was between him and the man he wanted, and she was nothing to him, and he didn't even look at her when he did it. The coffee carafe left the burner. Later, Gerald would try to describe the next 40 seconds to his wife, and he would fail every single time. The problem wasn't memory. He'd had perfect recall of every moment. The problem was that what he'd seen didn't fit inside the words available to him. He'd sit at the kitchen table and start the sentence 3 different ways, and eventually just stop and shake his head and say, "You'd have had to be there." And even then, what he saw was this. The carafe, still hot, still full, held in Nora's left hand because she'd moved it there 4 seconds before the door opened, made contact with the inside of the first attacker's forearm at the precise angle that caused 2 things to happen simultaneously. The liquid went up and across his face, and the handle of the carafe locked briefly against the nerve cluster above his wrist, and his fingers opened involuntarily, and the shotgun dropped. She was already moving before it hit the floor. The second man, the one with 2 handguns, had his right arm raised, and she took it at the elbow, not grabbing it, redirecting it, the barrel pointing suddenly at the ceiling as she moved past him and into the space he'd been occupying, and his second shot, because he fired. He absolutely fired. The sound of it cracking through the diner and punching a hole in the drop ceiling above the counter went straight up. She used his own momentum to put him into the edge of booth 2. The third man came at her from her left, and she was already turning, already low, and she came up under his reach, and her elbow connected with something she didn't stop to identify, and he folded. The fourth had the presence of mind to step back and create distance and raise his weapon properly, the textbook response. And it would have worked against almost anyone in that room. She picked up a menu from the counter and threw it at his face. Not hard enough to hurt. Hard enough to make him flinch and raise his hands half an inch and break the perfect line he'd drawn, and that half inch was enough. And she closed the distance in 2 steps, and his weapon was somewhere on the floor before he'd finished processing what had happened. The fifth man grabbed her from behind, both arms around her shoulders, lifting her off her feet, which was, she understood in the fraction of a second it took, the right instinct. Take her mobility away. It was good thinking. She dropped her weight, drove both heels back into his shins, felt his grip fracture at the surprise of it, and used the moment to break his hold and turn inside it, and the back of her head. She didn't like doing that one. She heard the sound it made, and she already felt bad about it before he'd finished going down. The sixth man had his gun up and pointed at her chest. He was the calmest of them, the most professional. He hadn't rushed in. He'd waited for his shot, and he had it now. They looked at each other. Nora was breathing harder than she wanted to be. Her right shoulder hurt where the first man had shoved her, and she'd taken part of the impact against the counter's edge. The sixth man's hand was completely steady. Salvatore De Luca's voice came from directly behind him, quiet and absolute. "Drop it." He did. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows, and one of De Luca's men saying something in Italian under his breath that, in context, required no translation. 5 of the 6 attackers were on the floor. The 6th had his hands up. 2 of De Luca's own men hadn't moved, not because they were slow, and not because they hadn't seen an opening, because there hadn't been one. Nora walked to the coffee machine. She checked the carafe, still about a third full, handle cracked but intact. She was aware that every person in the room was looking at her, and she was choosing, very deliberately, not to think about that right now. Her shoulder would need ice. The noise level had probably terrified Eleanor, and she needed to check on Eleanor. And she needed to figure out what to do about the holes in her ceiling. One problem at a time, she found a clean mug. She poured. She slid it across the counter to where Salvatore De Luca had sat back down. Because apparently he had sat back down, because apparently that was the kind of man he was. "Your coffee got cold," she said. He looked at the mug. He looked at her. And Salvatore De Luca, who had survived 3 attempts on his life, who had built an organization that half of Chicago's law enforcement had spent a decade trying to dismantle, who had not been surprised by anything or anyone in longer than he could accurately remember, said nothing, because he had no idea what to say. Outside, at the edge of the city, a police siren was starting somewhere far away, getting closer. The rain kept coming down, and Nora Vale picked up a broom from behind the counter and started cleaning up the broken dishes, because someone had to, and she was the only one in the room who seemed to remember how. The broom made a sound against the tile floor that seemed, in the silence of that room, almost obscene in its normalcy. Scrape, Scrape. The bristles catching broken ceramic. A coffee mug handle spinning across the floor and coming to rest against the foot of stool number 4. Nora kept her eyes down and kept moving. It was not that she was unaware of the room. She was profoundly, exhaustingly aware of every single thing happening in it. The way DeLuca's 2 bodyguards had shifted their weight toward the 6 men on the floor without being told. The way the man she'd put into booth 2 was breathing through his nose in the shallow, careful way that meant his ribs were complaining. The way the nurse in the scrubs was still pressed against the wall of her booth and hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, was staring at Nora with the particular expression of a person whose understanding of the world had just been quietly revised without her consent. She was aware of all of it. She was choosing, for exactly as long as she could manage it, to keep sweeping. "Someone needs to explain to me," said the man who had been first through the door, the one with the shotgun, who was now sitting against the base of the counter with his back against the cabinet below the register, his right arm cradled against his chest. What just happened? Nobody answered him. "I'm serious," he said. "Someone explain it to me." "Shut up, Marco," said one of the others, the one who'd had 2 guns. I was sitting up now, leaning against the edge of booth 2, and the way he was holding his right shoulder said she'd done something to it when she'd redirected the barrel. Not broken, but the kind of wrong that would remind him of tonight for the next several weeks, every time he reached for something above his head. Marco, the one with the shotgun, looked at her. His face was wet, not from the rain, from the coffee, and there was already redness spreading along his cheekbone and jaw that would be something significant by morning. He looked at her the way men look at things they don't have a category for, half fury and half something else that was close to fear and didn't want to be. "You," he said. Nora crouched and swept a pile of broken ceramic into the dustpan. "You're going to want to ice that," she said, without looking at him. "The cheekbone. Sooner rather than later." The sound Marco made was not a word. From his stool, DeLuca said nothing. He had both hands around the fresh mug of coffee she'd poured him, and he was watching her with an expression that was perfectly still in a way that had nothing to do with calm. She'd seen that expression before, on other faces, in another life. It was the expression of a man running very fast calculations behind very quiet eyes. She didn't want him running calculations about her. She stood up and carried the dustpan to the trash can at the end of the counter and emptied it and came back and started sweeping again. "Nora." That was Gerald from the far end of the counter. His voice was steady, which was something. Gerald had a good voice for emergencies, the product of 2 decades of talking people down from bad decisions in parking garages at 3 in the morning. "Nora, maybe you could—" "I'm fine, Gerald. I wasn't going to ask if you were fine." "I know." She glanced at him. "Sit down, please." He sat down. He picked up his coffee mug and then set it back down because his hands, she could see, were shaking slightly. Just slightly. The aftermath. She understood it. She'd been living in the aftermath of things for years. In booth 3, Eleanor was sitting back up, her husband's arm around her, her face very white. Frank was saying something to her quietly. She nodded and nodded. Her hands were flat on the table, pressing down, steadying herself. The nurse in the scrubs, Nora still didn't know her name, which bothered her more than it should have, had finally peeled herself away from the wall and was sitting in her booth with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the ruined eggs on the floor with the expression of someone who has just realized she is not, in fact, having the worst night of her life. Someone else in this room has that covered. "Everybody else okay?" Nora said to the room. Not loud, conversational. Frank raised a hand like a student in class. "We're fine," he said. His voice was remarkably even, which told her that Frank had probably been some kind of something in a previous era of his life and hadn't lost the muscle memory. "Eleanor needs a minute." "Take all the time you need." She looked at the nurse. "You?" The nurse looked up. She was young, maybe 24, 25, with the kind of exhaustion in her face that belongs specifically to people who work 18-hour shifts, taking care of other humans, and are still not sure they did enough. She looked at Nora for a long moment. "I'm a nurse," she said, which was not an answer but was somehow also the only answer available. "I know," Nora said. "You've got eggs on your shoe." The nurse looked down. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then stopped being almost a laugh and became something smaller and harder to name. She pulled her foot back and wiped her shoe on the edge of the booth seat. Okay, she said. I'm okay. DeLuca spoke. Tell your people to leave. He wasn't looking at Marco when he said it. He was still looking at Nora. All 6 of them. Tell them to go. Marco's head came up. We don't take orders from... I wasn't talking to you. DeLuca turned his head slowly and looked at Marco with eyes that had the particular quality of deep water, reflecting everything, revealing nothing, and suggesting strongly that there was no bottom you'd want to find. I was talking to whoever sent you. You're going to want to call them. Tell them the job is done. Marco stared at him. Tell them, DeLuca said, that I'm dead. The room was very quiet. They'll know you're lying, Marco said. They'll know, DeLuca agreed, when they see me again. But that gives me time, and time is what I'm buying right now, so make the call. One of the other men on the floor, the one with the shoulder injury, shifted and looked at Marco. Something passed between them, some quick private calculation, and Marco pulled out his phone with his uninjured hand and made a call. Nora kept sweeping. She didn't listen to the conversation, or rather she listened and didn't let it matter yet. She was focused on the floor, on the task, on the particular discipline of staying inside the next 30 seconds rather than the next 30 minutes, because the next 30 minutes had too many variables and 30 seconds was manageable. 30 seconds at a time. She'd learned that a long time ago. The call ended. Done, Marco said. Good. DeLuca set his mug down and stood up, and even standing, even with the cut on his jaw and whatever was wrong under that dark shirt, he managed to fill the room in a way that had nothing to do with size. Now all 6 of you are going to walk out that door. You're going to tell whoever asked that the diner was empty. You're going to tell them nothing, and in return, I'm going to choose tonight only not to remember your faces. The man on DeLuca's left, one of his bodyguards, square-faced, maybe 40, with a nose that had been broken enough times it had stopped trying to be symmetrical, made a sound. Sal. Just the name. Low. Warning. I know what I'm doing, DeLuca said. You're letting them walk. I'm letting them deliver a message. He looked at Marco again. You understand the message. Marco was quiet for a moment. He pulled himself carefully off the floor, testing his arm, his face already tightening into something less readable than it had been. He looked at Nora once, briefly, and she met his eyes and held them, and he looked away first. Yeah, he said. I understand. Then go. They went. It took about 90 seconds, the 6 of them collecting themselves and their weapons, which DeLuca's bodyguards had gathered into a corner and did not return until they were at the door, and filing out into the rain. The door closed behind them. The room seemed to expand slightly with the absence of bodies. Gerald let out a breath. Lord, he said, and then stopped himself and said, I mean, it's fine, Gerald. Are those people coming back? Nora looked at DeLuca. DeLuca looked at her. Not tonight, he said. Not these 6. That's not a complete answer, Gerald said. No, DeLuca said. It's not. The square-faced bodyguard, she would learn his name was Carmine, but not for a while yet, had his phone out and was talking into it quietly, words she couldn't make out, moving toward the back of the diner and away from the civilians with the instinctive discretion of a man who'd spent years keeping his employer's business off of other people's ears. The other bodyguard had stationed himself near the door and was watching the street through the rain-streaked window with the methodical patience of a man who had been watching streets through windows his entire adult life. DeLuca looked at the nurse. You should go. She looked at him. I should stay, she said. He? She nodded at the direction of the man who'd had his ribs introduced to the corner of a booth. Whoever he is, one of those guys, I heard him hit that seat. I want to make sure nothing's... He's fine, Nora said. You don't know that. He landed at an angle that puts the impact across the lateral ribs, not the anterior. If he'd hit chest first, he'd be having different symptoms right now. He's not. He's fine. The nurse looked at her for a very long moment. Who are you? She said. Nora picked up the dustpan again. Nora, I work here. The nurse looked at her the way you look at a sentence that contains no incorrect words but somehow adds up to something that doesn't parse. I'm going to stay, she said, just for a few minutes, just to make sure that couple over there is... Eleanor. Frank raised his hand again. Eleanor might need to sit for a minute, if that's all right. It's all right, Nora said. Coffee's on me, both of you. Well, Frank said, with the careful mildness of a man who has made peace with the world's surprises, that's very kind. DeLuca waited until the room had settled into something that wasn't exactly calm, but had at least stopped being immediate before he spoke to her again. He'd gone back to his coffee. He'd finished half of it. She'd refilled it once without being asked, because his hands, the left one especially, kept reaching for the mug the way hands reach for things they need and have briefly lost. I need to know your name, he said. You already heard it. Your full name. She looked at him across the counter. Why? Because I want to know who you are. I'm the waitress who works the graveyard shift. She picked up a cloth and started on the counter. That's who I am tonight. DeLuca's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger. She didn't think he was angry. It was more like a man accustomed to a particular kind of friction, encountering a completely different kind and not yet having the right tool for it. What you just did, I need to make more coffee, she said. The pot took a hit. Give me a few minutes. He stopped. He watched her move to the machine and start the process, opening the filter, measuring, the specific domestic mundanity of making a fresh pot of coffee at 2:30 in the morning. And she could feel him watching, and she let him watch, and she kept her hands occupied and her face neutral. You're not going to tell me anything, he said. I'm going to tell you your refill will be ready in 4 minutes, she said. Behind her, she heard him exhale. Not in frustration, something more complicated. Carmine came back from the far end of the diner and leaned down and said something close to DeLuca's ear. DeLuca listened. His expression didn't change, which was more information than if it had. How far out? He said quietly. Carmine said something she couldn't hear. Fine. DeLuca pushed the mug away and stood up again. He reached into his jacket, his left hand this time, with that tremor she'd clocked earlier, more visible now, and pulled out a clip of bills and set them on the counter. For the damages. And he seemed to calculate something. For your discretion. She looked at the money. It was a substantial amount. She could see that without counting it. Keep it, she said. He blinked. She didn't think Salvatore DeLuca was a man who blinked much, and when he did it meant something. It's for the... I know what it's for. She turned around. I don't want it. The room was quiet, except for Eleanor asking Frank something in a very low voice and Frank answering. DeLuca looked at the money on the counter. He looked at her. His hand moved toward the bills and then didn't pick them up, just rested there for a second, fingers flat on the counter. And she looked at those fingers and noticed again the tremor and noticed too that there was something else. The way the fabric of his shirt moved when he breathed. The shallow, controlled quality of each inhale. The way he'd been managing his left side all night. You're still bleeding, she said. I'm aware. How bad? I've had worse. That's not an answer either. He looked at her with those flat, deep eyes. It grazed the ribs. It's not serious. Graze the ribs usually means something scraped along bone, she said, which means the skin is open and the intercostals are inflamed, and you probably heard every time you take a breath it's deeper than absolutely necessary, which means you've been breathing shallow for however long since it happened, which means your oxygen is lower than it should be, which explains the hand. I was very still. I'm a waitress, she said, before he could ask. I'm just observant. Carmine was looking at her from across the room with an expression that was not admiration and not hostility, but something precisely between them, the look of a man reassessing a situation he thought he'd already assessed. The other bodyguard hadn't moved from the door. DeLuca said, I need you to come with me. She'd been waiting for it, and still, when it came, she felt something cold and specific move through her chest. No, she said. There are people coming. Then you should leave before they get here. They're coming here, he said. The 6 who just walked out. Marco is not a man who forgets a face. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand that the problem you're describing is a problem you created by walking through my door. His jaw moved. That's fair. I know it's fair. She picked up the bills from the counter and held them out. Take your money, get in your car, and let me handle my own situation. Your situation, he said quietly, is that by morning your name will be on a list you do not want to be on. Not because of anything you did wrong, because of something you did right in a room full of people who do not tolerate that distinction. The coffee machine made the sound it made when it finished, a low, sustained hiss, and she turned and poured a cup and slid it to him, more from muscle memory than intention. He didn't touch it. "Come with me," he said again. "One night, somewhere safe while we figure out the situation." "I don't know you." "I know." He picked up the coffee. "That's the only honest thing I can offer you right now. I know you don't know me, and I know that makes this worse, and I'm asking anyway." The nurse cleared her throat from across the room. Everyone looked at her. I'm going to go now," she said, standing up carefully, gathering her bag with both hands. She looked at Nora. "I don't know what's happening. I don't want to know what's happening." She paused. "But are you actually okay?" Nora looked at her. She thought about the honest answer to that question, which she hadn't been asked in years, and she set it aside. "Yes," she said. "Go home. Get some sleep." The nurse nodded. She glanced at DeLuca once, a quick, assessing look that spoke to her professional training, checking him for color, for steadiness, for the particular signs that someone is closer to the edge than they're admitting. And then she was moving toward the door, and then she was through it, and the bell above the frame made its small, ordinary sound, and she was gone into the rain. Nora looked at Frank and Eleanor. Frank was already helping Eleanor with her coat. He looked at Nora over his wife's head. "We're going to head home," he said. "Of course." "Same time Thursday?" Something moved in her chest at that. The simple, absolute persistence of ordinary life in the middle of everything else. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded. He took Eleanor's arm and they moved toward the door, and the bodyguard at the door stepped aside without being asked. Whatever DeLuca had communicated to him was working. And the bell rang again and they were through. Gerald was the last one at the counter. He had his hands wrapped around his mug, which was empty, and he was looking at Nora with an expression she recognized and didn't want to deal with right now, the expression of a person who is putting together a picture from pieces they've been looking at separately for 2 years and have just now understood belong to the same image. "Gerald," she said. "Don't," he said. "I'm not going to—" "Don't tell me you're fine. Don't tell me go home." He leaned forward slightly on his stool. "I've been coming in here for 2 years. I've watched you refill my coffee 600 times. I've talked to you about Marcus's Little League games, and you remembered every game, every score, every player's name, every time." His voice was steady, but she could hear the thing underneath it. "So don't tell me you're fine, and don't tell me to go home like I'm a customer you're managing, because I'm not." She looked at him for a moment. "Gerald." "What?" "Go home. I mean that with the most genuine respect I have for you." She held his eyes. "I need you out of this room." He looked at DeLuca. He looked back at her. He stood up. He put his hand on the counter for just a second, a brief pressure, there and gone. He picked up his jacket from the stool beside him, and he walked to the door, and the bodyguard let him through, and the bell rang a third time, and then the diner was quiet. Just her. DeLuca. Carmine. The bodyguard at the door whose name she didn't know yet. The fluorescent light above the register flickered once, twice, held. DeLuca put the money back in his jacket. She hadn't told him to take it. He just did. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said. "The answer is the same." "Then let me tell you what happens if you stay." I wasn't threatening her. She understood that. His voice had none of the quality of a threat. It had the quality of a man reading a situation accurately and sharing the reading. "By 6 a.m., Marco has described you to people who specialize in finding faces. By noon, they have your name. By tonight, I understand the timeline," she said. "Do you?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the diner. The cracked vinyl, the flickering light, the electrical tape repairs on the booths, the neon of the ATI's all-night sign casting its partial pink light through the rain on the window. And something shifted in his face. Not pity. Not quite. "How long have you been here?" he said. "At the diner? In this life? The one where you're just the waitress?" The question landed somewhere she hadn't protected properly. She picked up the money he'd left on the counter the first time. She'd put it down when she handed it back, and apparently he'd left it again, which was either stubbornness or strategy, and she suspected both. And she walked to the register and she put it in the till, and she wrote a note on the receipt pad that said damage repair and tucked it under the cash drawer. Ray would find it in the morning. Ray wouldn't understand it. Ray would accept it because Ray had learned over 2 years to accept things about Nora Vale he couldn't explain. She took off her apron and folded it and set it on the counter. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the edge of the counter, looking at the surface. The coffee ring stain between stools 6 and 7 that never quite came clean, the groove near the register where someone had once repeatedly set down a heavy ring, the small chip at the far end that had been there since her first shift. She looked at all of it. 2 years and 4 months. She picked up her jacket from the hook behind the coffee station. One night, she said. Not to him exactly, to herself, testing it. DeLuca didn't say anything. If your people touch me, she said, turning to face him, for any reason, at any time, they won't. That's not a guarantee. No, he said. It's not. He held her eyes. But I'm making it anyway. She looked at Carmine. Carmine looked back at her with the expression of a man who has worked for Salvatore DeLuca for 11 years and has therefore learned not to react to developments he did not predict, of which there have been, over 11 years, a significant number. She looked at the bodyguard by the door. He was watching the street. He had, she noted, been watching the street consistently, never letting his attention drift, never using the chaos of the last hour as a reason to lose focus on his primary function. She respected that. She looked at DeLuca. I'll need 5 minutes, she said. I have to leave a note for my manager. Something moved in his face. Not surprise. She didn't think he allowed himself surprise, but the closest thing to it. Okay, he said. She was already moving toward the back office, pulling the door open, and then she stopped. The light above the register, she said, without turning around. What about it? It's been flickering since September. Then you have someone fix it. Silence. Yeah, he said, I can do that. She went into the back office, and she closed the door and she stood in the dark for a moment and pressed both hands against the wall and breathed. Her shoulder hurt. Her hands were not shaking, which she was grateful for, because she needed that, the not shaking, right now. She needed her hands to write a note and her legs to carry her back through that door and her face to be whatever it needed to be for however long this lasted. She found a notepad and a pen and she wrote Ray, took emergency personal day, details later, sorry for short notice, N, and she set it on the desk under his coffee mug where he'd find it first thing. Then she sat in his rolling chair for exactly 30 seconds. She thought about the last time she'd left a room like this. The last time she'd walked out of somewhere safe because there was no longer such a thing as safe. And whatever she'd done to try to stop that had already happened. And the only remaining question was what came next. She thought about a man who had been her father standing in a kitchen in the early morning, earlier than this even, 4 a.m. or so, making coffee with his back to her, his shoulders set in that specific way they got when he was angry and trying not to show it, trying to keep the anger out of the room so it wouldn't touch her. She thought about how he'd failed at that, not because the anger escaped, but because she'd always been able to read it. She'd gotten that from him. She got a lot of things from him. She stood up, she put on her jacket, she opened the door and walked back into the diner, and she didn't look at the counter, or the booths, or the neon sign visible through the rain on the window. She looked at DeLuca. I have 2 conditions, she said. He waited. 1. Nobody asks me anything tonight. Not in the car, not wherever we're going. Tonight I answer 0 questions. Agreed. 2. She picked up her keys from the hook by the door and then put them back. Because there was no car. She'd walk to work. She always walked to work. And for a half second, that small, ordinary fact, no car, just keys to an apartment she might not be able to go back to, was the thing that almost broke the controlled surface of her face, almost, but didn't. 2. When this is done, when whatever this is done, I walk away. No obligations, no arrangements, no ongoing anything. DeLuca was quiet for a moment. And if I can't promise that, he said, then I stay here. Another moment. Agreed, he said. She looked at him, held it for a beat, reading him the way she read everything, looking for the tells, the micro-adjustments, the small muscular shifts that precede a lie, and found nothing definitive either way, which was the most honest answer she was going to get from a man like this. She walked to the door. The bodyguard opened it. The rain hit her immediately, cold and sideways, and the street outside was empty in every direction, the black SUVs idling at the curb, the city making its low, continuous sound around them. She stood on the threshold for 1 second. Behind her, the fluorescent light above the register flickered once and went out, and for the first time in months, the whole diner was steady. She stepped out into the rain. The door swung shut behind her, and 3 blocks away, in a parked car with its lights off and its engine running quiet, a man with a phone pressed to his ear said 2 words to whoever was on the other end. He said, "She's moving." The SUV smelled like leather and gun oil and something underneath both of those things that she couldn't immediately name. Some specific chemical residue that her body recognized before her mind caught up to it, and when it did catch up, she identified it and set it aside and looked out the window. They were moving north on Halstead, then cutting east. The rain was heavier now, thick enough that the streetlights made halos, and the city beyond them dissolved into orange smear. She was in the second SUV, middle row, Carmine to her left, and a man she hadn't seen inside the diner to her right. Younger, maybe 32, dark-haired, the kind of still that isn't calm but is very well practiced. DeLuca was in the first vehicle. She'd watched him get in without help, which told her the rib injury was manageable but not comfortable. The bodyguard from the door, she still didn't have his name, was driving. Nobody had spoken since they left the diner. She watched the city move past the window. She knew Chicago well enough to track their route without signs. The particular rhythm of the blocks, the spacing of the lights, the way the architecture shifted as neighborhoods changed. They were heading toward the lake, staying off the expressways, using residential streets she wouldn't have known to take if she hadn't spent 2 years walking this city at 3 and 4 in the morning, which was when it showed you what it actually was rather than what it wanted you to think. Carmine had his phone out and was reading something, or appearing to read something. The younger man to her right was watching the cross streets. She kept her hands in her lap and her breathing even, and she thought about the man in the parked car. 3 blocks away, lights off, engine running. She'd clocked him on the way out, peripheral, automatic, the same way she clocked exits and blind spots and the position of every moving body in any room she entered. A dark blue sedan, domestic, current year or close to it, parked facing the wrong direction for the block, which was either a traffic violation or an operational choice, and she knew which one. He'd been on the phone. She hadn't said anything. She'd thought about saying something and decided against it because the calculation was simple. If DeLuca's people already knew about the car, telling them was unnecessary. If they didn't know, telling them created a set of consequences she didn't have enough information to predict. So she'd said nothing, and she'd gotten in the SUV, and now she was tracking the route north and trying to determine whether the blue sedan was behind them. She couldn't tell. Too much rain, too many lights. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which was good, but she could feel the shoulder now, a deep, specific ache starting from where she'd hit the counter's edge and radiating up into the neck. And she rolled it once, carefully, testing the range of motion. "You're hurt," Carmine said. She glanced at him. He was still looking at his phone. "I'm fine," she said. "That's the second time you've said that tonight." It was true both times. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back, and they did that for a moment. The particular wordless assessment of 2 people who have both spent time in situations that required them to read other humans quickly and accurately, recognizing that quality in each other. "Which shoulder?" he said. "Left. Ice it tonight, and the morning." "I know." He went back to his phone. The younger man to her right shifted slightly, and she felt his attention on her profile, less subtle than Carmine's. The attentiveness of someone still young enough that looking careful and being careful hadn't yet become the same thing. "What?" she said, without turning her head. He didn't answer, but he looked away. The SUV turned onto Lake Shore and the city opened up on their left, and even through the rain and the dark, she could feel the lake out there, enormous and cold, the way you always could. That particular pressure, the sense of all that open horizontal space pushing back against the vertical density of everything else. They drove for another 12 minutes. She counted. The building they pulled into was not what she'd expected, which meant she had to revise her expectation of DeLuca, which she hadn't wanted to do. She'd expected somewhere fortified, obvious in its seriousness, the kind of place that announced itself through its own security. She'd spent time in places like that, in a different chapter of her life, and she knew what they felt like, the way they pressed down on you, the specific weight of all that institutional protection. This was a mid-rise residential building, 12 or 13 stories, nothing distinguished about it from the outside. The parking garage they pulled into was ordinary concrete, ordinary lighting, the kind of unremarkable that was, she understood as she got out of the SUV, itself a choice. Unremarkable was its own form of invisible. DeLuca was already out of the first vehicle, talking quietly to the bodyguard from the door, whose name, she learned in the next 30 seconds, was Vincent, and Carmine fell into step behind her as they moved toward the elevator. DeLuca glanced back once, checking her position. She noted it. Not the glance of a man making sure his asset wasn't running. Something else. Less certain. The elevator was small and they rode it to the 9th floor in the particular compressed silence of people who are too tired for any available conversation. She watched the numbers. She noted the camera in the upper right corner of the elevator, the small and probably unnecessary detail of its placement, angled slightly down rather than straight, covering the center of the floor rather than the door, which told her something about whoever had specified the security setup. Someone who worried less about what came through the door than what happened between people already inside. That was an interesting priority. The apartment was a corner unit. She clocked it automatically as she came through the door. The layout, the sight lines, the exits. Kitchen to the left, open to the living room. 2 hallways, one short to what was probably a bathroom, one longer with doors off it. Windows on 2 sides, east and north, the lake faint through the rain on the east-facing glass. The furniture was functional rather than personal. Good quality, but impersonal. The furniture of a space maintained for use rather than habitation. Safe house. Not the man's home. She was glad she'd understood that before she could make anything of the books on the shelf or the absence of photographs. "There's a room at the end of the hall," DeLuca said. He'd moved to the kitchen and was standing in front of the counter with both hands flat on it, in a way that suggested the counter was providing more support than it appeared. "Clean clothes in the dresser. They won't fit, but they're clean. Ice in the freezer. There's food." "You said no questions tonight," she said. He looked at her. "I said you didn't have to answer questions. I can still talk." She set her jacket on the back of a chair. "Your ribs," she said. "Have someone look at them tonight, not tomorrow." "Carmine. Someone with medical training, not someone who's good at field dressing." She looked at Carmine. "No offense." Carmine raised one hand, palm out. "None taken," the gesture said. She looked back at DeLuca. I was watching her with those calculations running behind his eyes, and she was tired and her shoulder hurt, and she was standing in a safe house belonging to the most feared man in Chicago after spending 40 seconds systematically disabling 6 armed attackers in a diner on Madison Street at 2:30 in the morning, and she recognized this calmly from a distance, somewhere past the edge of what she could manage on reserves. "Good night," she said. She walked to the hallway and she opened the door at the end of it, and she went in and she closed it, and she stood in the dark of a strange room, and she breathed. She didn't sleep. She lay on the bed with her jacket folded under her head because she'd used the actual pillow behind her shoulder, and she stared at the ceiling and she listened to the apartment. The low conversation from the living room that went on for about an hour, the sounds of people moving, 2 separate moments of someone's phone ringing and being answered in a voice too low to parse. At some point the voices stopped. At some point the apartment went quiet. At some point the rain stopped too, and that was almost louder, the absence of it, the way the city reasserted itself in the silence. She thought about Gerald, about whether he'd gotten home okay, whether he'd told anyone. She didn't think he had. Gerald was not a man who volunteered things, and she'd been clear, and he'd respected it. She thought about Frank and Eleanor and the particular bravery of old people, the kind that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up quietly in the middle of catastrophe and holds a wife's hand under a table. She thought about the nurse, whose name she still didn't know. She thought about the man in the blue sedan. At 4:47 she got up, because lying still was becoming a specific kind of futile, and she went to the window and she looked out at the lake. The rain had left the glass clean and the water was dark gray, barely distinguishable from the sky, and there were lights out there somewhere, vessels, towers, the far shore, but they were distant enough to be theoretical. She pressed one hand flat against the glass. She thought about her father, standing at a different window, looking at a different body of water. The way he stood when he was thinking about something he hadn't told her yet. She thought about her mother with her back to the room, washing dishes, talking without turning around. The way she did when she was saying something she needed to say but couldn't say face to face. Some combination of privacy and protection and the specific economy of a woman who had learned to feel her way through difficult conversations without letting them become the conversations they actually were. She pressed her hand harder against the glass. They'd had a word for it. Her parents. A joke? or the shape of one. When things got complicated, when a case got heavy, when the edges of the work started to bleed into the life, her father would come home and put his service weapon on the high shelf in the closet and close the door and come to dinner, and her mother would look at him and ask, scale of 1 to 10, and he would give her a number, not always honest, probably, but a number. And her mother would nod and they would eat dinner, and whatever the number was, they would carry it together without naming it any further than that. She had not had anyone to give a number to in a very long time. She took her hand off the glass. She turned around and went back to the bed, and she lay down, and this time, eventually, she slept. She woke at 7:12 to the sound of raised voices. Not loud. DeLuca's apartment, or whoever's apartment this was, had solid walls and a door she'd noted was heavier than standard residential, but raised, unmistakably, the sharp frequency of men arguing, and she was on her feet and at the door before she'd made a decision about it, one hand on the frame, listening. Two voices. DeLuca and Carmine. The words were not clear, but the shape of the argument was that specific rhythm of a long-standing argument that had been waiting for the right moment to surface, the kind where both people already know every move the other is going to make. Then a third voice. She didn't know that one. She opened the door. The living room had acquired another person overnight. He was sitting in the chair nearest the kitchen table. Her jacket was still on its back, which meant he'd either not noticed it or not cared. And he was perhaps 60, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that had the particular topography of a man who had spent decades outdoors in difficult weather. He was dressed in a suit that was slightly wrong for his body, the suit of a man who wore them when required and didn't think about them otherwise. He looked at her when she came in. DeLuca looked at her. Carmine looked at the floor, which told her more than either of the other two. "Good morning," the man in the chair said. His voice was the voice she hadn't recognized, low, flat, with a Midwest flatness that had been polished over time into something almost neutral, but not quite. "I've been wanting to meet you." She looked at DeLuca. DeLuca's jaw was set. "Nora? Who is he?" she said. "My name is Harlan Briggs," the man said. He didn't stand. "Deputy Director, Federal Organized Crime Task Force, Chicago Field Office." The room was very quiet. "I see," she said. She looked at Carmine. He was still looking at the floor. The angle of his head told her he was not ashamed exactly, but that he was choosing carefully not to be present in this moment more than required. She looked at DeLuca. Something in his face, the set of it, the precise quality of the stillness, told her that this was not something he had arranged, that Harlan Briggs in that chair was as much a development to him as it was to her. But he had known, she calculated in the 3 seconds she was looking at him, he had known before she came out of that bedroom, and he had not woken her up, and that was a choice. "How long?" she said to DeLuca. He held her eyes. 40 minutes. "How did he know we were here?" "That," Briggs said from his chair, "is my question for you." She turns to look at him fully. Harlan Briggs had the kind of face that was accustomed to waiting people out. The face of a man who had conducted enough interrogations, formal and otherwise, to understand that silence was a more effective tool than most questions. He was looking at her with a calm, patient interest that was itself a form of pressure. The interest of a man who already knew quite a bit and was gauging how much more you were going to give him. She didn't give him anything. "You know who I am," she said. "We know who you were," he said. "Margaret and David Vale's daughter. That's a sad story, that. Your parents were good officers, good people." He said it without sentiment, which was somehow worse than if he'd performed some. "We lost good sources when we lost them." She felt something move through her that she controlled by looking at a spot on the wall above his left shoulder and breathing at the exact rate she was already breathing and not faster. "We've known about you," Briggs continued, "for about 14 months, since the Kellerman situation in Milwaukee." He tilted his head slightly. "You remember Milwaukee." It wasn't a question. Milwaukee had been a man named Kellerman who ran a trafficking pipeline through the port of Milwaukee and who had, 14 months ago, been very publicly embarrassed when 3 of his couriers were found bound and incapacitated in a warehouse off Kinnickinnick Avenue with a folder of operational documents neatly placed beside them, and an anonymous call to the Milwaukee PD routed through enough redirects to be untraceable. She had been in Chicago within 48 hours. She had thought she'd been clean. "We weren't going to approach you then," Briggs said. Your situation was delicate, and frankly, you'd done us a service. We were content to observe. He paused. Last night changed the calculus. What calculus? She said. The men who sent that team to this location, he gestured vaguely in the direction of the diner. The organization behind the attempt on Mr. DeLuca are not independent operators. They are, and have been for approximately 7 years, the Chicago arm of a trafficking network that we have been building a case against since before your parents died. She heard that. She felt it the way you feel a step that isn't there, the lurch, the sudden recalibration. What network? She said. Her voice was flat. It has several names in our files. The name they use for themselves, when they use any, is Waitress Group. Briggs watched her. I imagine that name means something to you. It did. It meant something she had spent a very large portion of the last several years trying not to think about, and hearing it spoken by a federal official in a safe house on the 9th floor of a Lakeshore Drive apartment building at 7 in the morning while her shoulder ached and her entire previous life sat 2 miles south in a diner with a broken ceiling tile made the room feel, briefly, like it was rotating. She sat down, not in a chair, on the arm of the couch, the nearest surface, because she needed to be lower to the ground, and she needed it without ceremony and without the appearance of needing it. My parents were investigating Waitress Group, she said. Your parents, Briggs said, were the reason we knew about Waitress Group. They'd spent 4 years building an intelligence file before anyone in this office was taking them seriously. By the time we were... He stopped, and there it was, the only genuine note she'd heard in his voice, something brief and specific that came through the professional casing. By the time we were paying proper attention, the situation had already moved beyond our ability to protect them. The room was silent except for the building's heating system, a low vascular sound running through the walls. DeLuca was standing by the window. He had turned away from the room, not, she thought, out of disinterest, out of something more complicated. He was giving her room, which was not a thing she'd expected from him, and which she would have to think about later. What do you want? She said to Briggs. What I want, he said, is what your parents wanted, the full dismantlement of Waitress. Not the Chicago arm, the whole architecture. He leaned forward slightly. What I have is 14 months of observing a remarkably capable woman who has been systematically working her way through Waitress's lower-tier operations for the better part of 3 years, and who last night walked into the single most operationally significant moment in 7 years of investigation by complete accident. She looked at him. Kellerman wasn't an accident. No, but the diner was. She didn't confirm it. Here's the problem, Briggs said. The problem is that your name is now on a Waitress list, not a watch list, not a persons of interest list, the list that does not have subheadings because it only has one purpose. He held her eyes. I can help with that. I can give you cover, resources, a different kind of protection than whatever Mr. DeLuca has in mind. She looked at DeLuca's back. DeLuca turned from the window. Their eyes met. You knew, she said. Not an accusation, a question. Not about Briggs, he said. Not about this morning. I meant Waitress. DeLuca's jaw moved. I knew the people who sent that team weren't independent. I didn't know the name. She looked at him for 3 full seconds, reading him, looking for the seam in it, and didn't find one. But you knew, she said, that whatever was behind last night was bigger than one night. Yes. And you brought me here anyway. I brought you here, he said, because the alternative was leaving you in a room with a broken ceiling and 6 enemies who now know your face. She looked away. She looked at the window past him, at the gray morning lake. There's something else, Briggs said. She looked at him. He reached into the jacket he was wearing, the wrong-fit suit, and he pulled out a photograph and set it on the coffee table in front of her. He set it face up, which was a choice, and he leaned back, which was another choice. She looked at the photograph. It was a man. Mid-50s, gray-haired, unremarkable in most ways, except for the specificity of the eyes, pale, light-colored, the kind of eyes that have a strong opinion of themselves. He was photographed from a medium distance, outdoors, not aware of the camera, moving in the way of a man accustomed to moving through spaces without being observed. She had seen that face before. Once. One time. In a parking lot in a suburb she hadn't been back to in 8 years. the night her parents died. His name is Edmund Graves, Briggs said. He is the operational director of Veritas Group's entire Midwest infrastructure. He has been for approximately 9 years. He was also... He paused here, and she understood that the pause was genuine, that this was the part he hadn't wanted to say, the part that had required 40 minutes of conversation before she came out of the bedroom. A senior external consultant to the Chicago Police Department's Tactical Training Division, from 11 years ago until 8 years ago. The heating system ran through the walls. The lake sat outside the window. He knew my parents, she said. He worked with your parents, Briggs said, for 2 years before they started the Veritas investigation. He let her hold that. We believe he was the source of the information that identified them as a threat to the organization. We believe he was the person who made the call. She looked at the photograph. Edmund Graves looked back at her, unaware, caught between one step and the next. She had spent 8 years not thinking about the parking lot, not thinking about the 15 seconds she'd stood at the edge of it before someone came and put her in a car and took her somewhere else, not thinking about what she'd seen and what she'd understood in the way that 16-year-olds understand catastrophic things, completely, without the protection of adult language for it. She had spent 8 years choosing, every single morning, not to be the person shaped by that parking lot. She had been wrong to think that was a choice you got to make by that parking lot. She had been wrong to think that was a choice you got to make permanently. He's here, she said. In Chicago. He has been, Briggs said, for the last 3 months. We believe he came to personally supervise a significant expansion of Veritas operations. The attempt on Mr. DeLuca last night was part of that expansion. DeLuca's territory represents a significant logistical resource that Veritas wants to absorb. He paused. When the hit failed, Graves will assume the exposure risk is significant. He'll move to consolidate and possibly to eliminate everyone who saw anything last night. She looked at DeLuca. DeLuca was looking at the photograph with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual. She had gotten better at reading him in 8 hours than she had at reading most people in months, and the opacity of his face right now was specific and deliberate. You know him, she said. DeLuca's eyes moved to hers. I know of him, he said. He reached out 6 weeks ago, through intermediaries. He wanted a meeting. He paused. I declined. Why? Because the terms he was proposing required me to absorb significant risk for disproportionate return, and because the intermediaries he used were not people I trust, and because something shifted in his face, a small, particular movement in the jaw. Because the way he structured the approach bothered me. How so? He knew things he shouldn't have known, about my schedule, about my route last night. He looked at the photograph. The attempt wasn't random. Someone gave them the window. The room absorbed that. Carmine, who had been silent for the entire conversation, said, Sal, we need to talk about Russo. DeLuca's response was immediate and visible and specifically involuntary, a tightening through the entire upper body that was gone in a half second, but had been there. Nora saw it. Briggs, she noted, had also seen it. Not here, DeLuca said. There's no version of this where we don't talk about Russo. Carmine. Someone told them the route, Carmine said. Someone inside. You know it and I know it, and sitting in this room not saying it doesn't make it... I said not here. Then when? Carmine's voice had risen, and she could hear in it the specific texture of a man who has been keeping something down for hours and is losing the grip on it. Because if it's Russo, then the people he talks to know where we are right now. Tonight. This morning. They know. The silence that followed that had a different quality than the silences before it. Heavier, structural, somehow. The silence of a weight-bearing wall discovering a crack. DeLuca looked at Carmine for a long moment. His face was doing things she couldn't track, and she thought that was probably the point, that he was working very hard right now to keep what was happening in his chest out of his expression, because Harlan Briggs was in the room, and because she was in the room, and because there were some things that a man like Salvatore DeLuca did not let other people see. Then he looked at her. I need a minute, he said. She stood up from the arm of the couch. She picked up her jacket from the chair. She was aware of Briggs watching her, and she decided not to look at him. I'm going to the kitchen, she said. I'm going to make coffee. She paused. And then I'm going to tell you what I know about Edmund Graves, which is more than what's in your file. Briggs was very still. More, he said. Significantly more. She looked at him. But we do this my way. I'm not an asset. I'm not a source. I'm not an informant, and I'm not under any agreement with your office, and I will not be. She held his eyes. I'm a person with information and a reason, and I will decide on my own terms how much of each I share and when. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. And if I subpoena your testimony, he said, then your legal team can explain to a federal judge why they'd like to compel testimony from a private citizen with no criminal record and no organizational affiliation. And the attention that process creates will cause Edmund Graves to be on an international flight before your paperwork clears the docket. Briggs's mouth moved. It was almost a smile. Your parents, he said, were very good at this too. She walked to the kitchen. She found the coffee, she found the machine, she ran the water, and she was halfway through the process, measured, automatic, the muscle memory of 10,000 similar mornings, when her hands stopped. They stopped completely, both of them, holding the carafe over the machine. Not shaking, just stopped. She stood there for a moment in the kitchen of a safe house belonging to a man she'd known for 5 hours, with a federal official 30 feet away and a mafia boss with a leak in his organization, and a photograph of a man on a coffee table whose face she had not let herself look at directly in 8 years, because she'd known, with the bone-level certainty of someone who had spent those 8 years preparing for exactly this, that if she ever let herself look at it, there would be no going back to the version of herself that could keep sweeping the floor and pouring the coffee and choosing, every morning, to be small and safe and invisible. The version that didn't want to be a legend. She poured the water. She pressed the button. She stood there and watched the machine work, and the coffee started coming through, and behind her she could hear DeLuca and Carmine's voices, low and taut, and the specific sound of two men confronting the reality that someone they trusted had already made a decision that could kill them both. The coffee came through. She found 3 mugs. She thought about her father's hands on a different coffee machine, in a different kitchen, early in the morning, making the coffee before anyone else was up, because he'd been awake since 4 running numbers he couldn't share at the dinner table. She thought about what he would say if he could see her in this kitchen. She thought he would probably say, scale of 1 to 10. She poured 3 mugs. She picked up 2 of them and walked back into the living room, and she set one in front of Briggs, and she walked to the window where DeLuca was standing apart from Carmine, his back to the room, looking at the lake with an expression she couldn't see. She set the mug on the windowsill beside him. He looked down at it. He looked at her. She held his eyes for exactly long enough to say, without saying anything, I know. I know what it is to have someone take something that was yours and use it against you, and there is nothing in the world that prepares you for that particular kind of loss. She went back to the kitchen for her own mug, and that was when her phone, the one she'd had in her jacket, the one she never gave the number to anyone, the one she'd had for 3 months and used only to call Delia and Mr. Kowalski's daughter in Milwaukee when the cat needed feeding. That phone buzzed. 1 message. No sender name. No area code she recognized. 4 words. We have your friend Gerald. She read it twice. Not because she hadn't understood it the first time. Because the second reading was a test. Of her hands, of her breathing, of the specific discipline she had spent years building for exactly this kind of moment. The moment when something external reaches into the part of you that you've kept separate from everything dangerous and touches it. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She set the mug down on the kitchen counter without sound, and she walked back into the living room and she looked at Briggs. How long have you had eyes on the diner? She said. Briggs frowned. Since last night. Standard. Gerald Watkins. Overnight security parking garage on Madison. 63 years old. He left the diner approximately 40 minutes after the incident. She turned the phone around and showed him the message. Who was watching him? Briggs looked at the screen. Something moved in his face that was not slow enough to be professional reaction. It was fast, instinctive, the expression of a man who has just discovered a gap in his perimeter that he did not know existed. Nobody, he said. He was a civilian. He was clear. We didn't. Then they followed him from the diner, DeLuca said. He'd come away from the window. He was standing in the center of the room now, and the quality of his stillness had changed completely. All that exhaustion, all that carefully managed physical damage, gone beneath something older and more functional. The man who had sat at a diner counter holding coffee for warmth was somewhere underneath this version. This version had made decisions that cost people their lives and lived with the specific weight of that long enough to carry it without bending. They had a secondary team on the street, standard protocol for a failed primary. You stay on the target's last known location and you wait for whoever leaves. Gerald left, Nora said. Gerald left, DeLuca confirmed. She looked at the phone again. The message was 4 minutes old. She had been standing in the kitchen for 4 minutes with this in her pocket and hadn't known it. And Gerald had been somewhere for 4 minutes with people she understood very specifically. And every minute from this point forward was a calculation she did not have the luxury of being wrong about. Can you trace it? She said to Briggs. We can try. These things take how long? 40 minutes. Maybe 30 if I don't have 30 minutes. She was already moving, back to the bedroom hallway, pulling on her jacket. I need the number traced, and I need the cell towers it bounced. I need it in 15. That's not. Then get more people on it. She came back into the living room with her jacket on and looked at DeLuca. The blue sedan. 3 blocks south of the diner on Madison, dark blue domestic current year parked wrong way on the block. That was your tail or theirs? DeLuca looked at Carmine. Carmine said, not ours. Then it was theirs, and it's been 6 hours, and they could be anywhere in the metro. She pulled her hair back, tighter than she'd worn it at the diner, and she was already thinking, running the geography, the timing, the logic of a secondary team that had followed a target from a scene at approximately 2:45 a.m. and now had him somewhere and was making contact at 7:16. They're not at the diner. Too much exposure. They're not south. The federal building is south, and they know you're federal adjacent. She looked at Briggs. They know about you? They know about the task force, broadly. So they move north or west. West is residential and complicated for containment. North is industrial, lower population density at this hour, better options for... She stopped. For what? DeLuca said. For holding someone temporarily, while they figure out what they actually want. She looked at him. This isn't about Gerald. Gerald saw the same thing every other person in that diner saw. They don't care about Gerald. They care about leverage, DeLuca said. They care about me. She held his eyes. This is a text to my phone, my number that nobody has. Which means Marco, or whoever Marco called from the diner floor, had enough time and enough resources to run my phone in 6 hours. And that is a very specific capability that is not standard for a street crew, which means Graves is directly involved. Which means this isn't actually about getting Gerald back to safety. What is it about? Briggs said. She looked at him. It's about getting me into a room with Edmund Graves, she said. The room held that. Which, she continued, is what I want anyway. DeLuca said, Nora, don't. She looked at him directly, not unkindly. Don't tell me it's too dangerous or that I should let Briggs handle it or that there's another way, because we both know there isn't, and we both know that Graves will move Gerald the moment he thinks I'm not coming, and I am not... She paused, not for effect, because she needed the pause, because saying the next part required the half-second it took to make it true. I'm not going to let a 63-year-old man with a grandson named Marcus get hurt because he came in for toast and coffee and treated me like a human being for 2 years. The heating system ran through the walls. DeLuca looked at her for a long moment, then he looked at Carmine. Get Vincent, he said, and call Mele. Carmine was already moving. Mele turned out to be a woman, which Nora registered without particular surprise. She arrived 11 minutes later, which meant she'd been close, standing by possibly, or simply the kind of person who moved fast when called. She was perhaps 40, Filipino-American, slight in the way of people whose physicality is entirely functional, and she walked into the apartment carrying a bag that she set on the kitchen table and opened with the efficiency of someone unpacking a kit they'd packed and repacked enough times the order was automatic. Inside the bag, 2 handguns in soft cases, spare magazines, zip ties, medical tape, a folding knife, a portable cell scanner the size of a thick wallet, and a manila folder. The folder, DeLuca said to Nora. Mele handed it to her. She opened it. Inside were 6 photographs, printouts from what appeared to be surveillance footage, grainy but functional. The blue sedan from 2 angles. A man getting out of it, caught mid-movement. She looked at the man's face. She didn't know him. She showed it to DeLuca. He shook his head once. She showed it to Carmine, who had come back into the room with Vincent close behind. Carmine looked at the photograph and something shifted in his face, a small, specific tightening around the eyes. Carmine, DeLuca said. Carmine looked up. Do you know him? DeLuca said. Not a question exactly. Carmine put 2 fingers on the edge of the photograph. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it for another second. His name is Trey, he said. He did logistics for Russo's side operation on the west side. The name Russo hit the room differently than any name had hit it yet. She watched DeLuca's jaw set. She watched Vincent look at the wall. She watched Carmine keep his eyes on the photograph, as though the photograph were easier than any other available surface. Then we know how they found the diner route, DeLuca said. Sal, we know. His voice was quiet, completely quiet, which she was beginning to understand was the register that meant maximum containment rather than minimum feeling. We'll deal with it after. Right now, he looked at Nora. Right now we find Gerald. Briggs from his chair said, I can have a tactical unit ready in 45 minutes. If we know the location, we don't have 45 minutes, Nora said. You don't know that. I know that the text was a contact, not an invitation. They sent it to see how I'd respond. When I don't respond the way they want, which is scared and alone and calling them back immediately, they'll move. She looked at him. How long on the trace? Briggs checked his phone. 20 minutes. So I have 20 minutes to come up with a location independently, or I follow their protocol and contact them, which tells them I'm working alone and scared and gives them the control of the exchange. Or, Briggs said, you let us, or I go in as them expecting me, she said, and use the fact that they want me in a room with Graves. That's suicidal, Vincent said from the door. It was the first thing she'd heard him say, and his voice was surprisingly even for the content of what he was saying. It's calculated, she said. Calculated suicidal, Vincent said. I need the scanner, she said to Melee. Melee looked at DeLuca. DeLuca looked at Nora. You can't go in alone, he said. I know. He waited. She looked at him, and she thought about conditions and agreements and the specific negotiation they'd had in the doorway of a diner at 2:30 in the morning, about obligations and ongoing arrangements and walking away clean, and she thought about how none of that was the actual question right now. I need 2 people, she said, people who move quietly and follow instruction without discussion mid-operation. I need the scanner, and I need a phone I can use to make contact with a number they won't trace back to this location. And I need... She looked at the bag on the table. I need to borrow the knife. DeLuca was quiet. Melee, he said. Melee zipped the bag closed and handed it to Nora, the whole thing. Vincent, DeLuca said. I'm already in, Vincent said. DeLuca looked at Carmine. Carmine picked up his jacket. You're injured, Nora said to DeLuca. You stay. He looked at her with those deep, flat eyes, and she looked back and did not move her position, and after a moment he said, I'm aware. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't argument either, and she decided to take it. She made the call from a clean phone at 7:41. 1 ring, 2. Then a voice she didn't recognize, young, male, controlled, said, You took a while. I was making coffee, she said. A pause. The pause of someone recalibrating. You understand the situation. I understand you have someone who has nothing to do with anything and I want him back. And we want a conversation. With who? Someone who's been looking forward to meeting you for a long time. The voice had a quality she identified and filed. Rehearsed, but not comfortable. The voice of someone delivering someone else's lines with someone else's confidence. He says you'll know where. She went cold. She went cold and she kept her voice absolutely level, and she said, Tell me anyway. The Kellerman Building, Port of Milwaukee Access Road. A pause. 2 hours. The line went dead. She looked at the phone for a moment. Milwaukee, not Chicago. Milwaukee, which was 90 minutes north, which meant Graves had been planning this before last night, before the diner, before any of it. He had a location ready and operational in Milwaukee, which meant he had resources there and support there, and he had chosen Milwaukee specifically because Milwaukee was where Nora had first made herself visible, where she'd left the folder beside the bound men in the warehouse, where Briggs had first known she existed. He was saying, I've known about you longer than you've known about me, He was saying, I'm not afraid of you. He was saying, come anyway. She told Vincent and Carmine. She told Briggs, who immediately started making calls and who she immediately understood was going to be 45 minutes behind her no matter what she said to him, which was actually, she decided, acceptable. Briggs arriving. 45 minutes after her was Briggs arriving at a scene rather than participating in an approach, which was a cleaner arrangement for what she needed to do. DeLuca walked her to the elevator. She hadn't asked him to. He stood in the hallway outside the apartment door, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has made a calculation he doesn't like and has made it anyway. You know what this is, he said, going in as they expect. You know what the room looks like. Yes. And you're going anyway. Gerald, I know why you're going. He stopped. He looked at the elevator door. That's not what I'm saying. She waited. I'm saying, he said, that I've been in rooms like the one you're walking into. Not the same room, but the same shape of room. And the thing about rooms like that is, he stopped again. His jaw moved. You have to decide before you go in what you're willing to do. All the way to the end of what you're willing to do, because in the middle of it is the wrong time to figure that out. She looked at him. I decided that a long time ago, she said. He nodded. He reached into his jacket and he held out something. A flat, matte black rectangle the size of a credit card. Emergency contact, he said. One button. Wherever you are, we'll have a signal. She took it. She looked at it. She put it in her jacket pocket. The light above the register, she said. He blinked. In the diner, you said you'd have someone fix it. Something moved in his face. Something human and tired and specific. I'll have someone there today. She nodded. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She got in. She watched his face as the doors closed, and the last thing she saw was not the expression of a mafia boss, or a man managing an asset, or a man with an angle. It was the expression of someone watching a door close on something they weren't sure was coming back, and not having any language available for that, and standing there with it anyway. The elevator went down. They took Carmine's car, a gray four-door so ordinary it was almost offensive, the vehicular equivalent of background noise, and they were on I-94 North by 8:15. Carmine drove. Vincent was in the passenger seat with the cell scanner in his lap, running it at intervals, checking for anything tracking the vehicle. Nora was in the back with the bag and the folder and her thoughts, which she was managing with the same attention she gave to everything else, deliberately, one at a time, not letting any single one take up more space than its contents warranted. She looked at the scanner results over Vincent's shoulder. Clean. Whatever they had on her phone, and they had something. They had her number. They had some access she hadn't secured tightly enough. They didn't have a tracker on her physical person, which meant the phone had been the vulnerability, and the phone was now in Briggs's possession back in the apartment. You know this building? Carmine said, not looking back. Eyes on the highway. I know the access road, she said. I know the warehouse district. I've been in the port area once, about 14 months ago. Armed? Not meaningfully. Vincent said, how many people you figure Graves brings to a thing like this? Minimum 6, probably more. He has resources and he's been operational in Milwaukee for at least 3 months, which means he has local support, which means the number could be significantly higher. Significantly higher, Vincent said. Like 20, 30 possible. Vincent was quiet for a moment. 3 of us. 2 of you, she said. You're not going in the building. Both of them were quiet. Explain that, Carmine said. You're the exit. You're what Gerald gets handed to when I bring him out. She looked at the back of Carmine's head. You go in and something goes wrong in there. There's nobody outside and Gerald has nowhere to go and this whole thing is a closed room. Something goes wrong in there, Vincent said. And Gerald isn't the... I know, she said. I know what I'm walking into. That's not the point. Another silence. The highway was moving, the gray November morning outside the windows, fields appearing between the industrial sprawl as Chicago gave way to the suburbs. You're going in alone, Carmine said. To a room with possibly 30 armed people. I'm going in as someone they invited, she said. That's different from going in alone. Is it? They want something from me. That gives me time. It gives me room. She looked out the window. The thing about rooms where people want something from you is that until they get it, you have a function. And as long as you have a function, you have options. Carmine glanced in the rearview mirror. She met his eyes. You sound like him, he said. Sal, when he talks about rooms. She looked away. How long have you worked for him? She said. 11 years. Do you trust him? A pause. In the ways that matter. What does that mean? It means he's made choices I wouldn't have made, Carmine said. It means he's done things I had to decide whether to live with. It means, he paused. It means he's also the only person I've ever seen make a decision based on something other than advantage, and mean it, and there's not a lot of people I can say that about. She thought about the elevator, the expression on DeLuca's face. She thought about a man who ran a criminal empire choosing, without apparent benefit, to protect a woman he'd known for 40 minutes. She had not resolved what she thought about that, and she was not going to resolve it in a car on I-94 with 80 miles to go. The access road, she said. I need to walk it before I go in. I need 10 minutes on the ground. You'll have it, Vincent said. She opened the bag on the seat beside her. She took inventory, not because she hadn't already done it at the apartment, but because doing it again was a form of control, a way of accounting for every element she could account for before she walked into the elements she couldn't. 2 handguns. She checked each one. She kept one and handed the other to Vincent without discussion. He took it the same way. Spare magazines. She distributed them. The knife. She put it in her right boot. The scanner she kept. She looked at the manila folder one more time. The grainy surveillance photographs. Trey's face mid-movement. The blue sedan at 2 different angles. And she memorized what she hadn't already memorized and closed it. She thought about Gerald at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, reading something on his phone with his glasses up on his forehead. She thought about the way he'd said her name in the diner before everything happened. Nora. The specific tone of someone who knows a person rather than a customer, who has been paying attention rather than just sharing the same room. She thought about Marcus and Little League. She pressed her shoulder blade back against the seat, testing the ache, measuring it against function. Manageable. Not good, not comfortable, but manageable in the way of something you set aside because there is no alternative to setting it aside. She was going to need the shoulder. The highway opened up north of the suburbs, and the lake appeared on the right, slate and enormous, a different gray than the sky, but the same value. The kind of morning that gave no information about the afternoon. She looked at it. She thought, scale of 1 to 10. She thought 9, maybe 9.5. She thought, okay. The access road for the Kellerman building ran along the port's southern perimeter, chain link on one side and water on the other, exposed in a way that Graves had almost certainly chosen deliberately. It was the kind of approach that stripped variables. No alleys, no adjacent structures, nowhere to stage backup without being visible from the building. Which meant he felt secure enough not to need the variables stripped. Which meant 30 was probably a conservative estimate. Carmine took the exit toward the port at 9:47. The industrial smell of the lakeshore hit even through the closed windows. Diesel, cold water, the specific ferrous smell of old steel and worked machinery. The streets here were wide and mostly empty at this hour. The dock workers' shifts not starting for another hour. The occasional flatbed truck moving slowly between terminal gates. She checked her watch. 12 minutes before the meeting time. Here, she said. Carmine pulled over on a service road a quarter-mile from the access road. The building was visible from here. A large warehouse structure, 2 stories, gray metal exterior, the kind of building that was built to function and had never been asked to be anything else. Several vehicles parked along the near side. She counted them, 8 vehicles, which meant somewhere between 16 and 40 people, depending on deployment. She looked at the building for a full minute, reading its geometry. Loading bays on the south, personnel door visible on the east. Roof access, probably an exterior ladder on the north face, standard for buildings in this district. Windows at second floor level, 3 visible from this angle. The glass, the kind of dark industrial glass that read as opaque from outside and probably wasn't from in. She thought about sightlines. She thought about the loading bay doors. She thought about where they would have Gerald, somewhere central, somewhere with limited exit options, somewhere she'd have to commit to before she could assess it. She thought about what Graves would want the room to look like when she walked in. She thought about what she needed it to look like instead. 10 minutes, she said. Stay on the service road. Keep the engine running. She looked at Carmine in the rear view. If I'm not out in 45 minutes, we come in, he said. No. She held his eyes. You call Briggs, and you tell him the location, and you get out of range. Don't come in. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, don't come in until Briggs has people on the perimeter. Carmine's jaw tightened. 45 minutes, she said. He nodded. Once. She opened the door. The cold hit her. Full lakefront cold. The kind with wind off the water that made the air feel actively hostile rather than merely unpleasant. She buttoned her jacket and she walked, not hurrying, along the service road toward the access road and the building beyond it. She could hear the water. She could hear the wind in the chain link. She could hear faintly a sound from inside the building that might have been voices or might have been machinery. She walked toward it. She was 50 yards from the personnel door when it opened. 2 men came out. She didn't stop walking. She kept her pace exactly the same, her hands visible, her chin level, and she looked at the 2 men and she registered, armed, both of them, weapons not drawn, which meant she was expected and they'd been told to bring her in rather than create an incident on an open service road. Good. They fell in on either side of her without speaking. She let them. The personnel door was heavy steel with a push bar, and one of them held it, which was almost courteous, and she walked through into the building. The interior was dim. The industrial overhead lights were running at partial capacity, casting a flat yellowish half-light across a space that was essentially one large open floor with structural columns at regular intervals and a mezzanine level running along the east wall. The floor was concrete, marked with old painted lines for equipment lanes. The smell was metal and cold, and somewhere underneath that, something organic that she categorized and didn't think further about. There were people in the room. She counted quickly without appearing to count, 14 visible, positioned at intervals with the geometry of a plan rather than a crowd. Specific points, specific angles, the arrangement of people who have been told where to stand. At the far end of the floor, beneath the mezzanine, there was a chair. Gerald was in it. He was upright. His hands were behind him. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that had dried but must have bled significantly when it was fresh. I was looking at her with those steady eyes, the eyes of a man who had 20 years of overnight shifts in parking garages, and what she saw in them was not panic but something very determined and very controlled. He gave her the smallest possible nod. She exhaled one breath. Between her and Gerald, standing in the center of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, was a man with pale eyes and gray hair, dressed in a suit that fit him perfectly, standing in a building full of armed men with the ease of someone standing in a room that has always been his. Edmund Graves looked at her. She looked at Edmund Graves. 8 years collapsed into nothing. Nora Vale, he said. His voice was exactly what she'd constructed from nothing in the years since the parking lot. Educated, controlled, the voice of a man who had decided a long time ago what he was worth and hadn't revised the estimate since. I imagined you taller. She looked at him for 1 second. She said, Let him go first. Graves smiled. It was a complete smile, which was somehow worse than if it had been partial. You're not in a position, I'm in exactly the position you put me in, she said, which means you arrange this room, which means you want something from me that requires me functional and present, which means Gerald is currency, not the point, and currency loses its value the moment the transaction is complete. She looked at him steadily. So complete it. Let him go. And then we can have whatever conversation you've been planning since Milwaukee. Graves looked at her for a long moment. He tilted his head. He looked at the man standing nearest Gerald, and the man reached down and cut the zip tie on Gerald's wrists. Gerald stood up slowly, with the careful movement of someone whose body has been in one position for too long and is registering objections. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. She moved her eyes toward the door, one small, clear motion, and he understood it because Gerald had spent 2 years learning to read her movements across a diner counter, and he was, she had always known, more perceptive than he let on. He started moving toward the door. Nobody stopped him. She watched him go, in her peripheral vision, all the way to the door and through it, and the cold air came in for a moment, and then the door swung shut. She breathed. She looked at Graves. All right, she said. Graves unclasped his hands from behind his back. He reached into his jacket, slowly, showing her it was deliberate, showing her he wasn't threatened by her. And he produced a phone and looked at the screen and looked back at her. Your parents, he said, built a very thorough file. Very thorough. It took us almost a year to find all the copies. He put the phone away. We never found the last one. She said nothing. I've spent 8 years, he said, operating under the assumption that the last copy would surface eventually. That someone, you or someone you'd given it to, would use it. He tilted his head again. That gesture was a habit, she noted, the specific tilt of a man who had spent years looking at problems from angles. It never surfaced. No, she said. Which means one of two things, he said. Either it doesn't exist and I've been operating under a false assumption for 8 years, which is irritating but manageable. He paused. Or it exists and you've been waiting. She looked at him. 8 years is a long time to wait, he said. Yes, she said, it is. Something moved in his face. Not doubt. Graves was not a man who allowed doubt to surface, but a recalibration, a small, specific adjustment in the way he was looking at her. Where is it? He said. She smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in, she couldn't calculate how long. It felt strange on her face, the specific effort of a smile that was not warm. That's not how this works, she said. Graves looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the man to his left, mid-40s, built, the bearing of someone with military background, and gave him a small nod. The man took a step toward her. She was already moving, not away from him, toward him, and left, closing the angle before he could establish it. And her right hand came up inside his reach, and the heel of her palm made contact with the underside of his jaw with enough force that his head went back and his forward momentum carried him past her, and he went down on the concrete in a way that made a very specific and unambiguous sound. She kept moving. She was already calculating, 14 visible, 2 at the door she'd come through, 4 along the east wall, 3 under the mezzanine stairs, the rest distributed through the columns. The man she'd just put down was the nearest. The next nearest was 6 feet to her left. 6 feet was a distance she could cover in less than a second. She covered it. The second man reached for his weapon, and she was inside that reach before he completed it, her left hand on his forearm, her body already turning, and she used the motion of his own draw to redirect, and the weapon skittered across the concrete floor, and he went into the nearest column shoulder first with a sound that bounced off the metal walls. Graves said, somewhere behind her, "Stop!" His voice was completely calm. She stopped. She turned. Graves was standing exactly where he'd been standing. He had not moved. Around the room, the remaining 12 men had their weapons up. Not panicked, not rushed, simply repositioned with the coordination of people who had been briefed on what she could do and had prepared accordingly. 12 weapons, all pointed at her. One of them was pointed at the mezzanine. She looked up. On the mezzanine 20 feet above the floor, there was a man she hadn't seen, hadn't been able to see from the personnel door, hadn't been able to count because he'd been above the sight line, and she hadn't had time to assess the upper level before being walked to the center of the room. He was holding a phone. Not a weapon. A phone. "That device in your jacket pocket," Graves said. "The emergency contact. We detected it the moment you walked through the door." He looked at her with those pale eyes. "The signal it's broadcasting. We've been blocking it since you arrived. Mr. DeLuca's people have been receiving a loop of the signal that says you're still on the highway." He paused. "Nobody is coming." She stood in the center of the room. 12 weapons. Gerald was out. Gerald was free, which meant Vincent and Carmine had him by now, which meant that part was done, which meant the only person currently in this room who was her responsibility was herself. She looked at Graves. He looked back. "The file," he said. "Tell me where it is, and this ends cleanly. You have my word." She thought about her father making coffee at 4 in the morning. She thought about her mother washing dishes, talking without turning around. She thought about a parking lot in 15 seconds and everything she'd built in the years since. Every choice, every morning, every diner shift and library book and quiet conversation with Gerald about a grandson she'd never met. She thought about what she'd decided long before she walked through the door. She reached into her jacket. Every weapon in the room tracked the motion. She pulled out the black card, the emergency contact, and she looked at it, and then she looked up at the man on the mezzanine with his phone, and she looked at the signal blocker he was running, and she did the calculation she'd been building since the service road. The card had one button, but the card also had a secondary function that DeLuca had not mentioned and probably didn't know about, because DeLuca had not built the card. Briggs had. She looked at Graves. "Your word," she said, "like the word you gave my parents." And she pressed the button. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. 2 full seconds of nothing, which in a room with 12 weapons pointed at a single person is an eternity, and she counted them. 1, 2. Watching the man on the mezzanine watch his phone, watching his expression shift from professional certainty to the specific confusion of a person whose equipment is telling him something that contradicts what he knows to be true. Then the signal blocker failed. She knew it had failed not because she heard anything, she heard nothing, but because the man on the mezzanine said one word, sharp and involuntary, and looked up from the phone at Graves, and that look contained everything she needed to know. Graves heard it too. His eyes moved from her to the mezzanine man, and back to her, and for the first time since she'd walked through the personnel door, his face did something she hadn't seen it do. It made a decision without being entirely certain what the correct decision was. That half-second of uncertainty was the only opening she was going to get. She dropped. Not sideways, not back, straight down, knees to concrete, making herself as small as possible in the center of the room. And the first shot came from her left and went through the air where her torso had been. And the second shot came from behind and caught the column 12 inches above where her head now was. And she was already moving along the floor, not standing, staying low, using the geometry she'd been building since she walked in. The columns at regular intervals, the equipment lane lines on the concrete, the 3 men under the mezzanine stairs who were the most dangerous because they had the most angle. She reached the first column. She put it between herself and the east wall guns, and she came up to one knee and she had the handgun out, and she fired twice. Not at people, at the overhead light panels on the east side. And the room dropped into half darkness, just the residual light from the west-facing skylights, pale and flat and directionally unhelpful, which was worse for people who'd been standing in artificial light for an hour than for a person whose eyes had been adjusting since the personnel door. She moved to the next column. A man came around it from the wrong direction, her direction, and she was too close for the gun to be useful, and she put her elbow into his throat and took his weapon as he went down and moved on. The room was loud now, not chaotic. These were trained people. They were maintaining coordination. She could hear it in the way the voices were clipped and directional, but loud in the way of a space where controlled people are working hard to stay controlled. She registered that and used it, moving when voices spoke because voices meant attention was oriented toward the speaker. She heard Graves, "Don't lose her." She heard someone answer from the mezzanine, a position and a direction, and she corrected her route based on what the answer told her they thought they knew, which was close but not accurate. Another man appeared from behind a column and she read his weight distribution, right heavy, weapon in the right hand, turning right. And she went left around him, and the back of his jacket gave her enough grip to redirect him into the path of the man coming from his left. And they went down together in a way that was messy, and she kept moving. She'd been in the room for 40 seconds, 4 men down, 8 upright with weapons in reduced visibility. Graves somewhere to her southeast, stationary. She could tell by the voice he wasn't moving, and that told her something important. He wasn't running, he wasn't directing from cover, he was standing in the open. Graves was not afraid of her, or Graves was afraid of something more than her. She came to the south wall, her back to the metal, and she breathed. 2 breaths, 3, and she assessed. The remaining 8 were redistributing, trying to establish a perimeter around her last known position, which was no longer accurate. They were good at this. She could see that. The coordination was professional, and the spacing was correct for what they were trying to do. The problem was they were doing it for a room with artificial light, and they were now in a different room. She moved along the south wall toward the loading bay doors. She reached the first bay door, steel, roll-up, the manual release on the left side, and she found the release and pulled, and the door came up with a sound that was impossible to miss, and the cold lakefront air poured in and the gray daylight cut a rectangle into the south wall, and everyone in the room knew exactly where she was. She stepped to the side of the opening before the first shot came. It came through the open bay door and out into the service road. The second shot hit the door frame. The third, she heard it differently, lower caliber, closer, came from inside, from her right, and she turned and there was Graves. He was 10 feet away. He had a gun. Not the weapon of a man who carries professionally, she could see that in the grip. Functional, but not practiced. The gun of a man who has always had other people carry guns for him and has kept one for contingencies. This was a contingency. They looked at each other across 10 feet of concrete floor in the gray light from the open bay door. And behind her she could hear the remaining men repositioning, converging, and she knew she had somewhere between 4 and 8 seconds before the angles closed. "The file," Graves said. His voice had not changed. That was the extraordinary thing. His voice was completely controlled, and she understood from that control that Edmund Graves was not a man who frightened in the way that most people frightened. He was a man who had made enough catastrophic decisions with enough calm that the calm had become structural. It wasn't a tool anymore. It was just what he was. That made him more dangerous. It also made him slower to adapt. "The file," she said, "it is in the custody of the Federal Organized Crime Task Force, Chicago Field Office." She watched his face. "Has been for approximately 40 minutes. Briggs has it." Graves' face went through something she catalogued carefully. Not the rapid dissolution of a man whose plan has failed, but the slower, more specific adjustment of a man revising a timeline. "You gave it to... My parents built it to be used," she said. "I've been keeping it safe for 8 years because using it at the wrong time would have burned the investigation. Briggs has been building toward Veritas for 7 years. He needed the file and the access and the right moment." She watched his eyes. Last night was the right moment. It was not entirely true. It was true enough. The file had been in a safe deposit box in a Milwaukee bank under a name that was not hers for 6 years. She had given Briggs the access code at 7:43 that morning, in the apartment, before she'd made the call to the number that had texted her. She had given it to him without conditions and without negotiation, which was the most significant thing she'd done that morning and which she had not told DeLuca or Carmine or anyone. She had given it to Briggs because her parents had built it for exactly this purpose, and because she had kept it safe long enough, and because walking into the Kellerman building without that piece already in place would have been something else entirely. It would have been what Graves was expecting, a woman with leverage arriving to use it. She hadn't arrived to use leverage. She'd arrived to close it. "You came in here with nothing," Graves said. "I came in here with Gerald out," she said. That was the point. The seconds were running. She could hear the 8 men converging. "You're going to be arrested," she said. "The building is surrounded." She did not know this for certain, and the look on his face told her he knew she didn't know it. But she continued, "Or it will be in the next 6 minutes. Which is the difference between you making a decision now or having it made for you." Graves looked at her. The gun in his hand was still raised. "You know what you are?" he said. She waited. "You're your father," he said. It came out different than she expected, not as an insult, not as a manipulation, something more complicated than either. The voice of a man acknowledging something real despite everything. "Exactly your father. He walked into rooms he shouldn't have walked into with the same expression you have right now." She breathed. "He walked into the wrong room eventually," Graves said. "I know," she said. "You put him there." Something crossed his face. She watched it cross and tried to identify it and couldn't entirely. Not guilt. She didn't think Graves had the architecture for guilt, but something adjacent, some recognition of a weight that had been distributed too widely to feel on any given day but existed nonetheless. "He was going to take apart everything I'd built," Graves said. "Yes," she said. "He was." "So was she." "Yes." A pause. "And now you," he said. "And now Briggs," she said. "I'm just the person who walked through the door." She heard it then. Exterior, perimeter, the distinctive pattern of law enforcement vehicles arriving in coordinated positions. The sounds that she'd spent a childhood hearing outside kitchen windows late at night when her father was on call and a case broke and the radio in the living room started going. Graves heard it too. His gun hand didn't lower. Behind her, she heard the 8 men hear it. The slight collective shift, the brief break in the coordinated movement, the sound of professional judgment, calculating and coming up with different answers for different people. Because some of those people were very committed, and some were committed to a specific amount, and this exceeded it. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "Put it down." His hand was very steady. His pale eyes were very steady. And she understood in this moment what she was looking at. Not a monster, which would have been easier, but a man who had made a specific series of choices over a long period of time with full awareness of what they were, and who had arrived at this room at the end of that sequence, and was determining, in real time, what the last choice was going to be. She had thought about this moment. In years of waiting and preparing and building towards something she couldn't name cleanly, she had thought about what she would feel standing in front of the man who had ended her parents' lives. She had thought she would feel rage, which she'd planned for. She had thought she might feel grief, which she'd also planned for. She had not planned for what she actually felt, which was tired. Tired in a way that went below the physical tiredness, below the shoulder and the concrete cold knees and the 40-minute car ride and the night without sleep. A tiredness that belonged to something she'd been carrying for 8 years and was now, in this moment, setting down. "I'm not going to kill you," she said. He blinked. "I'm not going to hurt you if you put it down," she said. "I'm going to step back and I'm going to let the people outside do their job, and you're going to be arrested, and there's going to be a trial, and the file my parents built is going to be the foundation of a federal case that takes apart Veritas from the operating infrastructure to the financial architecture to the corrupted officials who made it possible." She watched his face. "That's what they built it for. That's what it's going to do." His hand was still up. "The alternative," she said, "is you make another choice." She did not specify what she would do if he made the other choice. She did not need to. He was looking at her and she let him look. Let him read whatever he needed to read, because she had decided walking through the door that there would be no performance in this room, no version of herself that was larger or harder or more inevitable than she actually was. And what she actually was had put 6 men on the floor of a diner in 40 seconds, and had come into this building alone, and he had enough information to make the calculation himself. The gun came down. Not dramatically. Not with the body language of a man surrendering to a moral epiphany. The gun came down with the simple, deliberate movement of a man who has made a tactical assessment and arrived at a conclusion. And that was all it was, and that was enough. She stepped back. Outside, the perimeter was active. She could hear it fully now. Multiple vehicles, verbal commands, the organized precision of a federal operation moving into established positions. The door behind her was the bay door she'd opened, and through it came the gray November daylight, and the cold and the distant sound of the lake. She heard the personnel door open. Briggs's people came in from 2 points, organized and fast, and the men still standing in the room made their individual calculations, and most of them made the same one. And the room began its long, procedural exhale. Briggs himself came through the personnel door 6 minutes after his team, which was correct. He was not the kind of man who entered rooms before they were secured. He looked at the room, at the men on the floor, at Graves standing in the partial light from the bay door, with his hands up and his expression somewhere she couldn't parse. Briggs looked at all of it for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. She was standing at the south wall. She had put the handgun on the ground, not dropped, placed, when Briggs's team came in, which was protocol and also just sense, and her hands were at her sides and her shoulder was registering something emphatic, and she was breathing through it. Briggs walked to her. He stopped a few feet away and he looked at her the way he'd looked at the room, thoroughly, taking inventory. "You pressed the secondary function," he said. "Yes." "How did you know it had one?" "I didn't, I hypothesized." She met his eyes. 40 minutes to surround a building in Milwaukee. You had people here already." "We had people in Milwaukee," he said. "Different operation. I redirected them." He looked toward Graves, where 2 of his agents were beginning the process of arrest. "You gave me the box this morning." "Yes." "Without conditions." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have used it, the file. You could have used it against him directly. Used it as, I know what I could have used it as." He looked at her. "My parents built it for a prosecution," she said. "That's what it's for." Briggs looked at Edmund Graves in the hands of his agents. Graves was not resisting. He was standing with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy for a long fight he knows is coming, the stillness of the courtroom rather than the warehouse floor, already translating himself into the next context. "We'll need your testimony," Briggs said. "Eventually, the process is long," she said. "I know. You know the law." "My parents were law enforcement," she said. "I grew up in the courtroom version of bedtime stories." He looked at her. Something in his face that was possibly the closest he got to warmth, which was a kind of particular professional respect that had lived alongside these events for long enough to become real. "What do you need right now?" She thought about it. "A phone," she said, "to make a call." He handed her his. She walked to the open bay door and stood in the daylight and called Carmine's number, which she'd memorized in the car on the highway, and he picked up on the first ring. "We're clear," she said. A pause. "Gerald? Is he with you?" "In the back seat. He's fine, Nora. He's asking for coffee." She laughed. It came out strange, not wrong, just unfamiliar, the laugh of a muscle she hadn't used in a while and had forgotten the specific quality of. "Tell him I'll get him a cup when I'm back." You're okay." It wasn't a question. It was Carmine asking anyway. "Yes," she said. She stood in the doorway for another moment after she hung up, looking out at the service road and the chain link and the water beyond it. The wind off the lake was the same wind it always was, insistent, cold, the wind of a body of water that did not particularly care what happened on its shore. She breathed it in. She thought about the parking lot, the 15 seconds, the specific quality of the light that morning, which had been exactly this quality, gray November, flat, honest. She thought about standing at the edge of it and understanding something she had spent 8 years not letting herself understand fully, because understanding it would have changed what she chose to be. She let herself understand it now. Her parents had known, for some time before the end, that the end was possible. She had found this in the file, not stated directly, because they were not people who stated things like that directly, but present in the structure of what they'd built, the way they'd distributed the information, the care with which they'd ensured it would survive them. They had built something that could outlast them because they had considered the possibility that they wouldn't outlast it. They had done it anyway. She had spent 8 years honoring the wrong part of that. She had honored the disappearing, the smallness, the choice to stay invisible. She had thought that was what they would have wanted, their daughter somewhere safe and uncollectible. But the file hadn't been built by people who wanted their daughter somewhere safe and invisible. The file had been built by people who believed that the work was worth finishing. She turned back into the room. She found Gerald outside, sitting in the back of Carmine's car, with the door open and his feet on the service road, his elbows on his knees, looking at the ground. The cut above his eye had been cleaned, she could see that. Carmine or Vincent had done something about it. And there was tape across it, uneven, the work of someone who was not a medical professional but had tried. She crouched in front of him. He looked at her for a long moment. "You want to tell me," he said, "what just happened?" "No," she said. "Didn't think so." "Gerald." I know. He looked at the cut on her jaw from the counter's edge, which she'd forgotten about. He looked at her shoulder, which she was holding slightly wrong and which he had probably noticed hours ago. "You okay?" "I'm okay." "You say that a lot." "I know." He looked at his hands. He turned them over once, looking at the marks from the zip ties, the indentation still visible. He turned them back. "Marcus has a game this Saturday," he said. She waited. I'd like to be there for it," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. At the 63 years of his face, the particular dignity of a man who had been put in a chair in a warehouse and had sat in it with his back straight and had looked at her across the room when she came in with those steady eyes, and had trusted her without having any particular reason to. "I know," she said. "So I'm not going to ask you anything," he said. "I'm going to get in this car, and these guys are going to drive me home, and I'm going to call my wife. Yes, I have a wife. I know I never mentioned her. We don't need to discuss that. And I'm going to tell her I'm fine, and that's going to be the extent of what I tell anyone about tonight." "Or this morning," she said. "Or this morning." He paused. "I want you to know that I'm saying that as a choice, not because you asked." She looked at him. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. He reached out and patted her hand once. Brief, unadorned, the gesture of a man who has raised children and knows the difference between comfort and intrusion, and stood up, with the careful movements of a body that has had a difficult 12 hours, and got in the back of the car. She stood up. Vincent was leaning against the front of the car with his arms crossed, watching the building entrance where Briggs's people were moving in and out. He looked at her when she stood. "Carmine's inside," he said. "Talking to the federal guys." She nodded. "You know what the funny thing is?" Vincent said. He said it looking at the building, not at her. She waited. "I've worked this job a long time," he said. "I've been in a lot of situations. I've seen people do things in bad situations." He paused. "I've never seen anything like what you did in that diner." She looked at the building. Or in there, he said, indicating the warehouse. I had help in there, she said. Briggs had people in Milwaukee. You didn't know that when you walked in. She didn't answer. I'm not saying it like a compliment, Vincent said. I'm saying it because I'm trying to figure out what you are. I'm a waitress, she said. He made a sound that was just short of a laugh. Right. Carmine came out of the personnel door and walked toward them. He looked at her, and he looked at Gerald in the car, and he did his own inventory the way he always did, quiet and complete. Russo, he said to her when he got close. She looked at him. Sal wants you to know. Russo gave himself up this morning. Before we left the apartment, he called Sal directly. He paused. Sal wants you to know that he handled it. She thought about DeLuca in the apartment, at the window, his hand flat on the sill beside the coffee mug she'd put there. She thought about what handled it meant in the vocabulary of a man who ran the organization Salvatore DeLuca ran. She thought about what it had cost him. Russo, she understood, had not been just an employee. The way Carmine had said the name in the apartment, the weight of it, the particular reluctance, told her that Russo was someone DeLuca had trusted in a way that did not have a purely organizational explanation. Is he? She started. He's in federal custody, Carmine said. Sal called Briggs before we left. She was quiet. He gave Briggs everything he had on Russo's arrangement with Graves. Everything. Carmine looked at the warehouse building. You have to understand, for Sal, I understand what that is, she said. He nodded. They stood there for a moment, the three of them, outside a warehouse in Milwaukee, in the gray November morning, and the lake was doing what the lake did, and somewhere inside the building Edmund Graves was being read his rights by a federal agent, and the file her parents had built was in Briggs's custody, and Gerald was in the back of a car asking for coffee. Let's go home, Carmine said. DeLuca was in the apartment when they got back. She had not expected him to be. She had constructed a specific expectation, that the apartment would be managed by Briggs's people by the time they returned, that DeLuca would have moved to whatever came next in the operational sequence of a man whose organization had just been significantly exposed in a federal investigation. She had expected the apartment to be impersonal and procedural when she walked back through the door. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a phone in front of him and an expression that said he had been sitting there for some time managing things from that table and was not particularly rested. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her shoulder, immediately, the way she'd looked at his ribs the night before. Sit down, he said. I know you're fine, he said. Sit down anyway. She sat down. He got up and went to the freezer and came back with ice wrapped in a dish towel and set it on her shoulder without asking. And she let him, because her shoulder had moved past the point of being managed through will alone, and the cold was immediate and real and helpful. He sat back down. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while. Russo, she said. Yes. How long? He looked at his coffee. Long enough that I should have seen it. That's the honest answer. She looked at him. At the cut on his jaw, which had been properly dressed now, clean tape in a straight line. At his left hand, which was resting on the table, still, the tremor gone or managed. The rib, she said. Scene 2, he said. Melee found someone. Good. Another silence. Briggs called, DeLuca said. About an hour ago. There's going to be a process, testimony, a long process. I know. For me too. He said it flatly, without inflection, the statement of a man who has been accounting and has arrived at the bottom of the ledger. What I've been doing, the organization, the way He stopped. Briggs was very clear about what cooperation looks like from this point. She waited. I told him yes, DeLuca said. She looked at him. All of it, he said. Not because I had to, because... He stopped again. He picked up the coffee mug and set it back down. Because I watched someone walk into a warehouse full of armed people this morning to get back a 63-year-old man who likes toast, and I sat in this apartment and I thought about what that looked like from the outside, what the whole thing looks like from the outside. He was looking at his hands. I've been telling myself a story about what I am for 25 years. Nora. And last night, and this morning, the story doesn't hold anymore. She held the ice pack against her shoulder and she looked at him, and she didn't say anything. I'm not going to be a different person, he said. I know what I've done. I know what it costs people. He looked up. But I can stop adding to it. That's not a small thing, she said. No, he said. It isn't. Outside the window, the lake was still gray, but lighter than it had been. The clouds thinning in the west, the light beginning to differentiate. The specific shift that happened in November when the morning finally committed to being the morning. The diner, she said. He looked at her. It's going to need the ceiling tile. And the window frame, the east one. There's a gap that's been letting cold air in since September. I was very still. And the light above the register, she said. His jaw moved. You said you'd have someone, she said. I'll have someone today, he said. She nodded. She looked at her hands on the table, the same hands she'd looked at in the safe house kitchen when the carafe was full and the machine was running. They were the same hands. They were going to do the same things tomorrow they'd done yesterday. Pour coffee, clear tables, wipe counters, remember the orders of people who needed somewhere to be at 2 a.m. when the city had gone quiet. She had thought, walking through the diner door for 2 years, that the smallness of it was the point. That the discipline of staying invisible was itself a form of purpose. She had been right and wrong simultaneously, which was, she understood now, the most honest thing that could be said about most important decisions. I have a question, DeLuca said. She looked at him. One question, he said, and then I won't ask again. She waited. Was there ever a version of last night where you were just going to stay behind the counter? He held her eyes. Where you were going to let whatever happened, happen, and keep yourself out of it? She thought about it. She thought about the 4 seconds between the tires on the street and the door opening. The coffee carafe in her left hand. The positions of the 4 customers, Gerald at the far end, Eleanor and Frank in their booth, the nurse who was already too close to something she hadn't asked to be near. No, she said. He nodded slowly. No, he said. I didn't think so. She took the ice pack off her shoulder and set it on the table. I'm going to sleep, she said. The room at the end of the hall, he said. I know where it is. She stood up. She picked up her jacket from the chair. Same chair, same jacket, the same small material fact of her life that had been here since this morning. And she folded it over her arm. She looked at him sitting at the table with his coffee in the gray morning light. This man who had walked into a diner for coffee and had not left the same person who walked in. And she thought that there was something honest in that, in the way a single night could revise a person if the night was the right shape and they were standing in the right position to be revised. She had not been revised. She had been, she thought, confirmed. Salvatore, she said. He looked up. She almost never used his name, and the fact of it registered on his face. Thank you, she said. For the car. For Carmine and Vincent. For... She paused. For staying in the apartment. He looked at her for a moment. I almost didn't, he said. I know, she said. Thank you for almost not. She walked to the hallway and she went into the room and she closed the door. And this time she did not stand in the dark. She went directly to the bed and she lay down with her jacket still folded over her arm. And she looked at the ceiling and she was asleep in less than 2 minutes. The diner reopened on a Thursday. Ray had found the note under the coffee mug and the money in the till with the notation, and the repaired ceiling tile and the east window frame sealed properly, and the light above the register replaced and burning steady for the first time since September. And he had accepted all of it with the stoic bewilderment of a man who had learned over 2 years that some aspects of employing Nora Vale were simply not going to resolve into explanation. She came in for her first shift on a Thursday night, the graveyard, same as always. The diner smelled the same, the vinyl on the booths was the same, the cracked seams and the electrical tape. The counter had its same geography. The coffee ring between stools 6 and 7, the groove near the register, the chip at the far end. Gerald came in at 1:15, same as always, and sat at the far end of the counter. He did not say anything about Milwaukee. He did not say anything about the night at the diner, or the men on the floor, or the federal investigation that had been running quietly through the Chicago news cycle for the past 2 weeks in the language of official statements and no-comment responses. He did not say anything about the cut above his eye, which had healed to a thin pink line that would probably not be noticeable in 3 months. He said, Marcus went 3 for 4 on Saturday. She poured his coffee. Yeah, she said. Doubles, two doubles and a single. He wrapped his hands around the mug. Kid can really hit. He's going to be good, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. He asked me about the cut, above the eye. She waited. I told him I walked into a door, Gerald said. She looked at him. He shrugged. What? He's 9. 9-year-olds walk into doors all the time. She turned away to the coffee machine, and the smile that came was the same strange, unfamiliar muscle as the one in the warehouse, but easier this time, quicker to arrive, less complicated in the feeling. Frank and Eleanor came in at 1:45, their usual booth. Frank hung Eleanor's coat on the hook at the end of the booth, and they sat down, and Eleanor looked at the new ceiling tile and the sealed window frame and the steady light above the register, and she looked at Nora. Better, Eleanor said. Little bit, Nora said. Decaf and lemon cake, Eleanor said. Both of us. I know, Nora said. She brought the decaf and she cut both slices of lemon cake herself, and she carried them to the booth, and when she set Eleanor's down, Eleanor put her hand briefly over hers on the table. Just for a second. There and gone. Nora went back to the counter. At 2 a.m, on the first Friday after the diner reopened, a black car pulled up outside. She was refilling Gerald's mug when she saw it. She continued refilling the mug. She set the carafe back on the burner. She found a clean mug and she poured a fresh cup, and she walked to the counter and she set it on the surface center, at the stool that was third from the right. The door opened. The bell above the frame made its small, ordinary sound. Salvatore De Luca came in from the cold, without his security detail. Just the man, in a dark coat still damp from whatever the weather was doing outside. And he sat down at the stool, and he wrapped both hands around the mug she'd already set out for him. Gerald looked at him from the end of the counter with the considered expression of a man making a decision about whether to know what he already knew. He turned back to his phone. De Luca looked at the light above the register. Steady, white, clean. He looked at Nora. She looked back. The diner held them all in its old, ordinary light. The late couple in the booth, the security guard with his toast, the mug in a man's hands at 2 a.m, and outside the city moved in its long, nocturnal register, and the neon in the window read Addie's All Night in its partial pink glow, and Nora Vale picked up the cloth and continued wiping down the counter. She was not a legend. She was not a weapon. She was not the girl from the parking lot, and she was not the waitress who had erased herself into invisibility, and she was not her parents, and she was not anyone's asset or source or symbol. She was a woman who had learned at some cost the difference between hiding and choosing, and who had made, in the small hours of a November morning in a diner on West Madison Street, the choice she would make again, every time, without hesitation.